The ship went down in 1906. Decades later, one of her lifeboats drifted into a quiet cove, dry, intact, and impossibly preserved. The Pacific coast in January is not a place that forgives. The water along the western shore of Vancouver Island is cold in a way that is not merely temperature. It is a quality, a character, something the ocean has held on to for 10,000 years and has no intention of releasing. The swells come in long and slow from the open sea, rising without apology, breaking without ceremony, and withdrawing again into the grey without any acknowledgement that anything was ever there. Fog sits on the water for days at a time, not wisping, not drifting, sitting, heavy and complete like a second sea laid over the first. This is a place called the Graveyard of the Pacific. The name was not invented by anyone in particular. It arrived the way all true names arrive, through repetition, through loss, through the accumulation of wrecks and bodies and silence until there was no other word left that fit. More than 2,000 ships have gone down along this stretch of coast. Their names are carved on monuments and written in logbooks and whispered in the accounts of survivors who spent the rest of their lives trying to explain what they had seen. The SS Valencia was a passenger steamship, 250 feet long, built for the coastal run from San Francisco to Victoria. She was not a grand ship. She was a working ship, serviceable, solid, not especially fast. She carried passengers who needed to be somewhere and cargo that needed to move. On the 3rd of January 1906, she set out from San Francisco in the dark, bound north, carrying 164 souls into weather that was already beginning to turn. What happened next would become one of the most debated maritime disasters in the history of the Pacific coast. The investigation would last months. The lawsuits would last years. The questions would never entirely stop. And then, 27 years later, in a quiet cove on the shore of Vancouver Island, a lifeboat from the Valencia was found, still floating, still sealed, still dry inside, and the questions began all over again. Let yourself settle now. The story will come to you gently. There is nowhere you need to be. The fog is thick tonight, and the sea is a long way off, and you are warm and safe and still. If you enjoy listening to stories like this, tales of the sea, of ships and storms and the strange persistence of memory, subscribe to this channel. New stories arrive every week, and they will be waiting for you. You are here now, not on the water, on the edge of it. Imagine yourself standing at the end of a wooden pier somewhere on the Oregon coast, or the coast of Northern California, or the western shore of Vancouver Island. It does not matter precisely where. What matters is the quality of the air. It is salt and cold and faintly green, the way coastal air always is, and it carries with it a sound that is not quite noise. The low, persistent breathing of the Pacific, which has been breathing this way since long before anything walked upright on its shores. The year in your mind is 1906. The month is January. The world is a different size in 1906. Not physically smaller, but experientially smaller, because the instruments that might help you navigate it are fewer and rougher and less precise. A ship at sea in January of 1906 carries charts that may be 20 years old in places, a compass that requires constant correction, and a captain whose knowledge of the local coast is a mixture of published information and personal experience, which is to say a mixture of what is probably true and what he remembers. The SS Valencia has been at sea for 2 days. She left San Francisco on the 3rd of January and has been running north through weather that has been deteriorating since the first night out. The swells are long and heavy. The wind is from the southwest, which is the worst direction for this stretch of coast, because it pushes ships eastward, toward shore, in exactly the direction they do not want to go. Captain Oscar Johnson has been watching his charts and watching the weather and watching the compass, and he believes he knows where he is. He is wrong. But you do not know that yet, and in a certain sense neither does he. That is the nature of these moments, the ones that will later be called disasters, the ones that will be investigated and debated and mourned for generations. They do not announce themselves. They arrive the way fog arrives, gradually, quietly, until you look up and realize the world has changed around you and the shore is somewhere you can no longer see. Close your eyes, if they are not already closed. The ship is running in the dark. The engines are steady below. The water is cold and very deep. And somewhere ahead, Though no one on board knows it yet, the coast of Vancouver Island is closer than anyone believes. The story will unfold slowly. There's no need to rush it. The sea has its own pace, and tonight that pace is yours. The SS Valencia was launched in Philadelphia in 1882, which made her 24 years old when she made her final voyage. Old for a working coastal steamer, though not ancient. She had been built by William Cramp and Sons, a shipyard that had been turning out vessels since the 1820s, and she had been built solidly, with the practical conservatism of an era that did not yet fully trust iron ships, and compensated with thickness wherever possible. Her hull was iron, her engines compound, her decks wooden in the places where decks were meant to be walked on. She was 252 feet long and 34 feet wide, with a displacement of just under 2,000 tons. Her history before the Valencia disaster was not entirely without incident. She'd run aground before, on at least 2 occasions, and had been refloated both times without serious damage. She had served in the Spanish-American War as a troop transport, which had given her a slightly different kind of history, the kind written in official records rather than maritime casualty lists. She had changed hands several times, ending up in the ownership of the Pacific Coast Steamship Company, which ran her on the coastal route between San Francisco and Victoria, British Columbia, stopping at various ports along the way. The coastal run was not glamorous work. The passengers who booked passage on the Valencia were not the sort who could afford the great ocean liners. They were workers and their families, settlers moving between cities, people visiting relatives, small merchants transporting themselves along with their goods. The fare was modest. The accommodations were modest. The Valencia had enough berths for perhaps 150 passengers in her cabins, and additional space for deck passengers who made the crossing with their belongings under oilskin and their faces turned away from the wind. On the 3rd of January 1906, she carried 164 people. The passenger manifest included men and women and children, a range of occupations and origins that was typical of coastal travel in that era. There were miners returning from winter layoffs. There were families who had spent Christmas in San Francisco and were now heading home to the communities of the North Coast. There were a handful of businessmen making the run for commercial reasons. There was a Portuguese family whose name would later appear in the survivor accounts. There were children young enough that their ages would be listed in the casualty reports in terms of months rather than years. Captain Oscar Johnson had been with the Pacific Coast Steamship Company for some years and knew the coastal run as well as any man in their employ. He was described by those who worked with him as a capable and experienced mariner, not brilliant perhaps, but steady. The kind of captain that a line running regular coastal service needed more than it needed a visionary. He had a first officer named Peterson, and a crew that numbered somewhere around 50, depending on how you counted the various categories of shipboard labour that existed in 1906. The weather on departure from San Francisco was already suggesting that the passage north would not be comfortable. January on the Pacific coast is reliably rough, and 1906 was not offering any exceptions. The glass was falling when they cleared the Golden Gate, and the swells were building from the southwest in that slow, patient way that means the disturbance generating them is far offshore and has been building for some time. Captain Johnson, looking at his charts and consulting with his officers, made the decision that all captains on this run made routinely. He would proceed. There was no particular reason not to proceed. The Valencia was a sound ship. The conditions, while uncomfortable, were within the range of what she was built to handle. Coastal steamers in 1906 ran in weather that would keep modern ferries in port. The schedule demanded reliability, and reliability meant going when the weather was merely bad rather than waiting for the weather to be good, because along this coast in January, good weather was a rumour and a hope rather than a reliable occurrence. The first day out was uncomfortable, but unremarkable. The ship rolled in the swells. Some of the passengers were sick. The crew went about their work with the practised indifference of people who have long since made their peace with the motion of the sea. The engines worked steadily in the dark below. The compass needle held to its heading. The coast of California slid past to the east, invisible in the fog and the dark but present in the charts, a known quantity, a reference. What was not known? What was the first in a series of navigational errors that would compound into catastrophe? Was how far the Valencia had drifted eastward. The currents along this coast are complex and not entirely predictable, and in heavy weather with no visual references available, a ship can be pushed significantly off her intended track without anyone aboard being aware of it. Dead reckoning, the navigator's art of estimating position based on speed, heading, and time elapsed, depends on the accuracy of all three inputs. If any one of them is slightly off, the error accumulates quietly, unseen, until it matters enormously. By the evening of the 4th of January, the Valencia was somewhere off the coast of Vancouver Island, running in fog and darkness, with a crew that believed they were farther offshore than they actually were. The captain had taken no soundings to verify his position. The coast ahead was invisible. The engines continued their steady turning, pushing the ship forward through the dark at perhaps 11 knots, and somewhere between the known and the unknown, the distance to the shore was shrinking. What makes a ship is not the iron of her hull or the horsepower of her engines, it is the people inside her. 164 of them, on the evening of the 4th of January 1906, were sleeping or eating or playing cards or watching the dark water through the portholes. They were as ordinary as people ever are, full of small worries and small hopes, thinking about the places they were going and the people waiting for them, not thinking at all about the coast that lay ahead in the dark. The sea does not distinguish between the important and the ordinary. It is simply there, vast and indifferent, and on certain nights it reaches out and takes what comes within its range. The engines turned, the ship moved north, and the dark coast of Vancouver Island waited, as it had always waited, with the patience that only stone and sea possess. If you had stood on the deck of the Valencia that 4th evening of January and looked aft, you would have seen nothing but dark water closing behind her wake, already smoothed out by the time the foam dispersed. The ship left no permanent mark on the surface of the Pacific. Ships never do. They move through and the water heals. Whatever passage they make is a temporary displacement, a borrowing of space, and the sea takes it back within minutes. The only record of a ship's passage in the end is the record kept by other people, by the manifests and logs and casualty reports, by the letters that passengers wrote before boarding and the letters they never had the chance to write after. There were children aboard whose names we know from the casualty records. There were women travelling alone, something not entirely common in 1906, which suggests particular circumstances, independence or necessity, or the kind of quiet determination that gets a person from one coast to another when the alternatives are worse. There were men who had spent the better part of a year working in places where the amenities were limited, and who were now making their way back towards something that resembled ordinary life. All of them were real in the way that people are real, complicated, individual, possessing the full set of private concerns and memories and plans that every person carries. And it is worth sitting with that reality for a moment before the story moves forward. The Pacific Coast Steamship Company ran a regular and reasonably profitable business. The Valencia was one of several vessels in their fleet. She was not their newest ship, nor their most prestigious, but she was reliable, and she was working, and she was underway. The company offices in San Francisco would not begin to worry for another day. The coast of British Columbia would not yield its silence for another night. And the 164 people on board had not yet begun to understand that their ordinary passage had become something else entirely. Before we continue with the Valencia, let us spend a moment with the coast itself. It deserves that much. The western shore of Vancouver Island, and the stretch of coast running south from it along the Washington and Oregon coasts, is not a place that was ever going to be easy on ships. The geography alone would have been enough to make it dangerous, even without the weather, even without the fog, even without the currents. But Vancouver Island adds to the physical complexity of the coast a layer of meteorological difficulty that has been defeating navigators since the first European ships came around Cape Flattery and tried to make their way north. The prevailing winds along this coast blow from the southwest for much of the year. In summer this is manageable. The swells are shorter, the fog burns off in the afternoons, and the visibility is often good enough to navigate by landmarks. In winter, the southwest winds strengthen, the swells lengthen and deepen, and the fog becomes a near-permanent feature of the coastal environment. Visibility can drop to zero for days at a time. Ships running north or south along this coast in January are navigating by instruments and memory, not by sight. The coast itself is treacherous in a very specific way. It does not rise gently from the sea. It does not offer gradual shallowing that would warn a ship of approaching danger. In many places along the Vancouver Island shore, the water is deep right up to the rocks, deep enough that a ship's soundings would show no warning bottom before the hull struck. The rocks are black and jagged and wet with spray, and they have been breaking ships since the first ships came here. The first recorded European shipwreck on this coast was in 1786, when the British fur-trading vessel Imperial Eagle ran onto rocks near Clayoquot Sound. The crew survived, but the ship did not. Over the following century, as maritime traffic along the coast increased, first the fur trade, then the gold rushes of the mid-19th century, then the regular coastal steamship service, the wrecks accumulated. By the time the Valencia went down, more than 100 ships had already been lost on this stretch of coast. By the time the 20th century ended, that number would approach 2,000. The Carmana Point Lighthouse, which sits at the southwestern tip of Vancouver Island, was established in 1891 specifically because of the wrecks. Before the lighthouse, ships running in fog had no way to know when they were approaching the Cape, and the Cape has a nasty habit of catching ships that believe themselves to be safely offshore. The lighthouse helped, but it did not solve the problem. Fog thick enough to obscure a lighthouse at close range is not an unusual occurrence on this coast. There is something in the character of this shoreline that resists human intention. It is not malevolent. The sea is not malevolent, any more than gravity is malevolent. It is simply implacable. It follows its own rules, which are consistent and ancient and indifferent to whether human beings find them convenient. The ships that have come to grief here did not fail because their captains were stupid or their crews were careless. Many of them failed because the margin for error on this coast is so small that even competent, careful navigation is sometimes not enough. The survivors of wrecks along this coast, and there were survivors, many of them across the years, told stories that shared certain qualities: the darkness, the speed of events, the cold of the water, the strange silence that sometimes followed the noise of the wreck, a silence that was not peaceful but empty, the sound of something that had been present and was now gone. Many survivors mentioned the shore being visible during the worst moments, close enough to see the rocks and the trees, close enough to hear the surf breaking, but separated from the ship by water cold enough to kill in minutes. That proximity of the shore was a particular cruelty of this coast. A ship wrecked in the open sea can take comfort, of a grim kind, in the pure fact of distance. There is nowhere to go, which simplifies the choices available. But a ship wrecked in sight of shore creates a different kind of anguish. The land is there, the trees are there. The solid ground that would mean survival is visible, achievable in theory, separated from the living only by a stretch of water that the cold makes impassable. The rocks along the Vancouver Island shore were given names over the years, names by the Nuu-chah-nulth people, who had lived here for thousands of years and knew every inlet and reef, and names by the European navigators who came later and often named the dangers that had already found them: Pachena Point, Bonilla Point, Carmana. These names appear in the Valencia accounts again and again, marking the geography of the disaster with the precision of a wound. What was it like to live on this coast and watch the ships go by? The small communities along the Vancouver Island shore, there were a few of them, accessible only by boat or trail, knew the sea in the way that only people who live beside it can know it. They knew the sound of surf in different kinds of weather. They knew what it meant when the barometric pressure dropped in a certain way. They had seen wrecks before the Valencia, and they would see wrecks after. The isolation of their settlements meant that when a ship went down nearby, help was both close and agonizingly far. Close in the sense of physical proximity, far in the sense of the time it took to get word to anyone with the resources to do something. The Dominion government had established a life-saving trail along the coast of Vancouver Island precisely for this reason. A rough path that connected the coastal settlements and allowed survivors of wrecks to make their way to safety on foot if they could get ashore at all. The trail was difficult. Parts of it were barely passable in dry summer weather. In January, in storm conditions with wet feet and hypothermic hands, it was a different proposition entirely. But it existed, and people had used it, and some of them had lived because of it. Into this landscape then, on the night of the 4th of January 1906, came the SS Valencia. Running in the dark, running in the fog, running, the captain believed, safely offshore, with plenty of water beneath the keel and plenty of sea room between the ship and the land. He was not entirely wrong in his confidence. He had reason to believe he was where he thought he was. The instruments said what they said. The charts showed what they showed. The calculations of speed and time and heading produced a position that seemed reasonable and consistent with what he knew of the coast. But the coast was not where he thought it was, and in navigation that is the only thing that matters. The sea holds its secrets in the dark. The rocks wait without impatience, and the fog simply lies on the water, as it has always done, as heavy and complete and indifferent as a closing eye. The Coast Guard station at Bamfield, established partly in response to the Valencia disaster, eventually became one of the most important search and rescue installations on the Pacific coast. But in January of 1906 it did not yet exist in any meaningful operational sense, and the coast between Cape Flattery and Berkeley Sound was as unmonitored as it had been 100 years earlier. Lighthouses were present at certain points, but they were spaced too far apart to eliminate the dark zones between them, and in heavy fog their lights were as much a danger as a guide. Mariners used them to fix position, which meant approaching close enough to see them, and in bad weather close enough to see a lighthouse was close enough to run aground. The history of the graveyard extends well beyond the Valencia. The Robert Kerr, the John Marshall, the Fanny Dutard, the Coloma, these are names from the casualty lists, ships that came to this coast in various conditions and left their iron and their cargo on its floor. Some were wrecked in fog, some were driven ashore by storms, some simply disappeared, leaving no survivors to explain what had happened, so that the record contains only a departure date and an absence. The coast collected them all with the same indifference. It did not distinguish between the large and the small, the old and the new, the careful and the reckless. What the graveyard of the Pacific teaches, if it teaches anything, is the limits of human confidence. The mariners who came to this coast were not foolish. They were experienced, trained, equipped with the best navigational tools available to their era. They understood the coast was dangerous, they planned accordingly, and still the coast took them, because the coast does not respond to competence in any reliable way. It responds to luck and circumstance, and the particular combination of wind and tide and fog that presents itself on any given night. Competence improves the odds. It does not guarantee the outcome. The graveyard is a record of all the ways that distinction matters. If you're drifting now, let yourself go. Subscribe so the next story is waiting when you return. Sleep well. The night of January 4th into January 5th, 1906 began like most winter nights on the coast run, dark, cold and wet, with a heavy swell running from the southwest and fog that came and went without schedule or warning. The Valencia was making good time by the standards of the route. Captain Johnson had calculated their position during the afternoon, using dead reckoning, speed times time plus heading, and believed the ship to be in open water, well clear of the Vancouver Island shore. His most recent estimate placed them near Cape Mendocino, which would have put them off the coast of Northern California, a considerable distance south of where they actually were. The error was not small. Later investigations would determine that the Valencia had been pushed significantly eastward and northward by the currents and the prevailing winds, and that by the evening of the 4th, she was in fact approaching the southwestern coast of Vancouver Island at a distance and angle that made collision nearly inevitable if her course was not changed. The captain did not know this. He had no way to know it. There was no GPS, no radio position fixing, no radar. There was only the compass, the clock, the charts, and the accumulated experience of years at sea, and all of those, that night, were leading him to a wrong conclusion. The passengers were settling for the night. Those who were ill from the motion had been ill since the beginning, and had learned to manage it or not, and were mostly in their bunks. Those who were well had eaten and drunk and played whatever small amusements were available on a working steamer: cards, conversation, the watching of the dark water through the portholes. The children would have been put to bed first, in whatever order families manage these things at sea, with the rocking of the ship substituting for the rocking of a cradle, which is an analogy that would have occurred to nobody at the time but feels unbearably poignant now. At around 11 o'clock in the evening, the first mate reported to Captain Johnson that he could hear surf. This was significant. Surf can be heard before it can be seen, and hearing it where you do not expect to hear it is the maritime equivalent of an alarm. Johnson came to the bridge. He listened. He made the decision that the sound was not surf but something else. The sea breaking against a distant vessel perhaps, or the sound of the wind in the rigging playing tricks. He did not order a course change. He did not order soundings. The ship continued north. This decision would later be described in the investigation as a critical error. It may well have been. But it is also worth noting that experienced mariners make such calls constantly, and are correct the vast majority of the time. The sound of surf in fog is one of the most ambiguous sounds in the coastal environment. It sounds like many things. It sounds like many things that are not surf. Johnson had decades of experience at sea. His instinct that night said not surf. His instinct was wrong. At approximately 11:45 on the night of January 4th, the Valencia ran onto a submerged reef. The impact was not what you might imagine. Not a single catastrophic explosion of force, but a series of heavy, grinding lurches as the hull rode up over the rocks and came down on them again. The engine stopped. The ship listed slightly. And then, in the sudden absence of engine noise, the sound that had been there all along became unmistakable. The breaking of heavy surf, close, very close, directly ahead and on both sides. The grounding happened near Pachina Point, at the southwestern tip of Vancouver Island, in water that was shallower than any chart the Valencia carried showed it to be. The exact sequence of events in the minutes after the grounding would be disputed for years, with different survivors remembering different things in different orders, which is the normal condition of disaster accounts, and should not be held against any of the people involved. Human memory under extreme stress is not a recording device. It is an impressionistic sketch that captures the emotional truth of a moment while missing or distorting the factual sequence. What is not in dispute is the immediate condition of the ship. She had struck hard. Water was entering through the hull. The degree of flooding was not yet clear. Some accounts suggest that in the first moments there was hope that the damage might be manageable, that pumps might hold the water back, that the ship might be pulled free on the next tide. That hope, if it existed, did not last long. The Valencia was a 2,000-ton iron ship on rock in heavy surf, and heavy surf does not pause while you assess the situation. Captain Johnson ordered distress signals fired. Rockets went up into the dark. They burst above the fog and the spray, visible to anyone who might be watching from the shore, but the shore was not watching. The shore was dark and rain-soaked and largely uninhabited at that hour and in that weather. The rockets went up and came down and disappeared, and the fog closed in again. The whistle was sounded. Its sound would have carried some distance in the still air under the fog, but whether it carried far enough to reach anyone with a boat and the knowledge of what to do with it was another question. The coast of Vancouver Island in January 1906 was not thickly settled. The nearest community of any size was several miles away. The nearest telephone was farther still. Below decks, the passengers were waking. The grinding halt of the ship had woken most of them. The listing, the slow, significant leaning of a vessel that should be upright, woke the rest. They came into the companionways in various states of dress and undress, asking each other what had happened, not yet frightened in the particular way you become frightened when you understand the situation, but already aware that something was wrong in a way that did not have a comfortable explanation. The crew began the process of preparing the lifeboats. There were 6 of them on the Valencia, plus life rafts. Getting lifeboats away in heavy surf at night from a listing ship, with a frightened crew and frightened passengers, is one of the most difficult things that human beings are asked to do in maritime emergencies. The physics of it work against you at every stage. The surf that threatens the ship also threatens the boats. The darkness that makes the shore invisible also makes every operation slower and more dangerous. The cold that is already beginning to affect the hands and feet of everyone on deck makes the mechanical tasks of boat handling, the lines, the cleats, the davits, harder than they would be in warmth. The first boats launched that night went badly. Some were swamped immediately by the surf. Some were smashed against the side of the ship before they could clear it. The precise accounting of what happened to each boat would take months of investigation to piece together, and even then the picture remained incomplete because many of the people who might have testified to what they saw did not survive to testify. What is clear is this. By midnight on January 5th, 1906, the SS Valencia was hard aground on the rocks off Vancouver Island, taking on water, in heavy surf, in darkness and fog, with her distress signals fired and unanswered, her lifeboats either away or destroyed, and 164 people who had been, a few hours earlier, sleeping or playing cards or looking forward to arriving in Victoria. The night had only just begun, and the shore was so close. That was the thing. It was so terribly close. You could hear it, and in the breaks in the fog you could see the dark mass of it, and it was close enough that in better water and better weather a strong swimmer might have made it. But this was not better water, and it was not better weather, and the sea between the ship and the shore was cold enough to stop a heart in minutes. There is a specific kind of waiting that the sea creates, not the waiting of impatience, not the waiting of boredom, but a waiting that has weight to it, that presses down on the chest and slows the breath and makes the ordinary functions of the body feel strange and distant. This is the waiting that the survivors of the Valencia would later describe in the accounts collected by investigators and journalists, and the simple human need to tell others what you had seen. By the early hours of January 5th, the Valencia's position had become clearer to those on board, in the way that things become clear when clarity is no longer comforting. The ship was stuck fast. The surf was breaking over the after portion of the deck. The water in the engine room was rising. The pumps were running but losing ground. Whatever hope had existed in the first minutes that the ship might be freed was gone now, and in its place was the necessity of surviving the night and getting help and getting off. The passengers had moved to the upper portions of the ship, the hurricane deck, the bridge structure, any place that was high and dry and for the moment above the breaking water. They had wrapped themselves in whatever they could find. Some had blankets, some had coats, some were in their nightclothes, which was what they had been wearing when the ship struck, and they were cold in a way that was already moving from uncomfortable to serious. The crew continued to work the lifeboats. A second series of attempts was made with better results than the first, or less bad results, which is not the same thing. Several boats did get away from the ship. Whether they made it to shore was another matter, and in the dark it was impossible to know. Men rode into the surf and the dark and the fog and either came back or did not, and those left on the ship watched them go and waited. Here is the detail that appears in almost every account of the Valencia disaster, the detail that every survivor mentioned, the detail that investigators and reporters fixed on as the central image of the catastrophe. The shore was visible. Not always, not continuously. The fog came and went, but enough. Enough to see the trees, enough to see the rocks at the base of the cliffs, enough to see the white of the surf breaking against solid ground. The distance was perhaps 50 to 75 yards at the ship's closest point to shore. In calm water, this was nothing. In the conditions of January 5th, 1906, it was everything. When morning came, grey and wet and cold, the light arriving gradually without any warmth or promise, those on the ship could see the shore clearly for the first time, and those on the shore, if there had been anyone to see, would have been able to see the ship. The Valencia lay canted on the reef, her stern submerged, her bow lifted slightly, waves breaking over her in regular sweeping motions that carried away anything not secured and some things that were. The rigging, the masts and their attendant web of ropes and cable, was still standing, and people had gathered in it. Imagine it. The rigging of a steamship in the early 20th century was not a comfortable place under any circumstances, not even in harbour, not even on a calm day. At sea, in storm conditions, clung to by people who had been awake all night and were cold and frightened and soaked through, it was a particular kind of ordeal. The ropes were stiff with salt and cold. The wind came in gusts that threatened to tear you loose. The ship moved beneath you in the surf, not the gentle rolling of a ship at sea, but the harsh, irregular lurching of a vessel being broken apart by waves. But the rigging was above the water. That was the thing. The water was coming up over the deck now, sweeping through the companionways, carrying with it the detritus of interior spaces, bedding, furniture, clothing, the small possessions of people who had packed for a coastal voyage and not for this. The rigging was above all of that, and in the rigging you could breathe, and as long as you could breathe and hold on, you were alive. How many people were in the rigging by the morning of January 5th? The accounts differ, as accounts do. Estimates range from 40 to 70. Some of them were crew, some were passengers, some were men who had helped with the lifeboats and ended up stranded when the boats could not return. Some were women, some, heartbreakingly, were children, held by parents or crew members who wrapped them in their arms and pressed themselves against the mast and held on. The surf continued. The ship continued to break up slowly, unevenly, in the way that iron structures resist destruction for a time and then surrender to it all at once. Pieces of the deck structure went first, the lighter elements, the wooden fittings, then heavier things began to give way. The stern section dropped further. The foremast was still standing, and it was around the foremast and its rigging that the largest group of survivors gathered and held. Help was coming. It was slow in coming, but it was coming. The distress signals of the night before had eventually been seen or heard by someone at the Carmana lighthouse, which was about 8 miles to the east. A message had gone out. The Cape Flattery life-saving station, across the Strait of Juan de Fuca in Washington, had been alerted. Ships in the vicinity had been notified. The machinery of maritime rescue, such as it was in 1906, was beginning to turn. But the machinery was slow, and the shore was close, and the people in the rigging watched the morning light strengthen, and wondered why no boats were coming from the land that they could see perfectly clearly, and could almost have reached with a good stone's throw. Why didn't the lifeboats from shore come sooner? This is the question that the investigation would spend the most time on, and the question that would generate the most controversy, and the question that the survivors who lived would spend the rest of their lives carrying. The answers were multiple and unsatisfying. The sea conditions were terrible, perhaps too bad for a shoreboat to launch at all. The distance from the nearest settlement to the wreck was significant. Communications in 1906 were slow. The life-saving station at Bamfield, the nearest on the Canadian side, was miles away, and received the alert only gradually as news moved through the sparse communication network of the coast. None of this was reassuring to the people in the rigging. None of this had the quality of comfort that human beings in extremis require. The shore was there, the trees were there. Somewhere behind the trees were people with boats, and the people in the rigging held on and watched the morning grow and waited for the boats that seemed to be taking so long to arrive. There are things that cannot be adequately described in ordinary language, not because they are beyond language, but because language that is adequate to them would be too much to bear at this quiet hour. Let the image be sufficient. The tilted masts against the grey sky, the figures holding there, the shore so close and the water between them so cold, the sound of the surf that had been there all night and would not stop. Hold that image gently, at a distance. You do not need to be there. You're warm and still and safe, and the water is far away. The news that a ship was in distress off the southwestern coast of Vancouver Island moved through the communication network of the region in the way that news moved in 1906, slowly, imperfectly, by telegraph where telegraph lines existed, and by word of mouth where they did not. The Carmana lighthouse had seen or heard something in the night. A message had gone to Victoria. Victoria had passed information to the various maritime authorities and life-saving stations along the coast. By the time the morning of January 5th was fully established, the general situation was known to people who had the power to send help. But knowing and doing were not the same thing. The first rescue ship to reach the vicinity of the Valencia was the city of Topeka, a coastal steamer that had been diverted from her own run when word of the wreck reached her. She arrived at the scene in the morning and found the Valencia on the rocks with survivors visible in the rigging. The city of Topeka's captain assessed the situation and determined that the sea conditions made it impossible to approach the wreck closely enough to be of direct assistance. He stood off at a distance watching, waiting for the conditions to improve. This decision has been criticised in the years since. Critics have argued that more could have been done, that boats could have been lowered, that the risk to crew was worth taking when the alternative was leaving people in the rigging to die. Defenders of the captain's decision have argued that sending boats into the surf under those conditions would have resulted in the loss of the rescue crew without saving anyone, converting a tragedy into a worse tragedy. Both arguments have merit. These are the kinds of decisions that cannot be made correctly in retrospect, because retrospect does not include the cold, the dark, the spray in the eyes, the sound of the surf, the real and present probability of losing your own men. The Queen, another rescue vessel, arrived not long after. She too assessed the situation and stood off. The sea conditions, by the accounts of those on the rescue ships, were worse than almost anything they had encountered in years of coastal service. The swells were heavy and irregular. The rocks around the wreck were numerous and unpredictable in their arrangement. The surf was high and violent. Getting a small boat through that approach without losing it was, by the assessment of experienced mariners, nearly impossible. From the rigging of the Valencia, the sight of these ships must have been both heartening and terrible. Help was there, visibly, unmistakably there, riding the swells a few hundred yards away, and it was not coming. The people holding on in the wind and the spray could see the rescue ships, and the rescue ships could see them, and between them was a stretch of water that neither side could bridge. Meanwhile, from the shore, something more immediate was being attempted. The light-keeping staff at the Kamana Lighthouse and the crew of the Bamfield Life-Saving Station were making their way toward the wreck site by the overland trail, the rough path that connected the coastal installations along this part of Vancouver Island. The trail was slow and difficult, and in January conditions barely passable, but it was being used. Men with ropes and equipment were working their way through the forest and down to the rocks above the wreck. The shore party reached a point above the Valencia sometime in the late morning. They could see the ship below them. They could see the people in the rigging. They were perhaps 100 yards away, but between them and the wreck was a cliff face, and at the base of the cliff was the surf. They had a Lyle gun, a small cannon used to fire a line over a ship in distress. But the angle was wrong, and the range was at the edge of the gun's capability, and the surf was creating a roar of noise that made communication difficult. They fired the Lyle gun. The accounts differ on how many times they tried and whether any of the lines came close enough to be of use. The physical reality of the situation, the angle, the wind, the distance, the spray, made the operation extremely difficult. Firing a line accurately under those conditions to a target that is partially obscured by surf and fog is not a simple or reliable procedure. The line gun was a tool designed for calmer moments and more favourable geometry. From the rigging, those who could see the shore party knew that help was there, on the land, above the water. The psychological significance of this cannot be overstated. The difference between being stranded on a sinking ship in sight of nothing is different from being stranded in sight of people who are trying to help. In one case, you're alone in the full sense. In the other, you're in a kind of terrible proximity, close enough to see that help exists, close enough to know it cannot reach you, which is a different kind of aloneness. Some men from the Valencia attempted to swim for shore. The water temperature in the Strait of Juan de Fuca in January is typically around 44 to 47 degrees Fahrenheit, which is to say between 6 and 8 degrees Celsius. In water at that temperature, an average person without protection will become incapacitated within 10 to 15 minutes, and will die within 30 to 60 minutes, depending on their size and physical condition. 50 to 75 yards of such water in surf with rocks at the far end is not a survivable swim for most people. Some of the men who attempted it were strong swimmers, and they still did not make it. Some of them were never found at all. A small number of people did make it to shore. Exactly how many is a matter of some dispute in the accounts, and the circumstances of their survival vary. Some were washed off the ship by waves and managed to catch something. A piece of wreckage, a life ring, something that kept them afloat long enough to be carried to the rocks. A few managed the swim. The shore party recovered several people from the rocks in a state of extreme hypothermia and began working to warm them. These people lived. Among those who made it to shore were several men who would later become key witnesses in the investigation. Their accounts of what they had seen on the ship and what had happened with the lifeboats and what they had observed in the hours after the grounding would form the core of the official record. These accounts are not always consistent with each other, which is not surprising. They are, however, consistent in certain broad outlines that give a picture of the night and morning that is vivid and terrible and unavoidable. The rescue ships stood off. The shore party worked. The sea continued to do what it does. And in the rigging of the Valencia, the people who were still there held on through the morning and into the afternoon, watching the rescue ships and watching the shore and watching the water rising up the mast with each heavy wave, and some of them prayed and some of them wept and some of them, by all accounts, simply held on in silence, which is perhaps the most human response of all. Does help always come in time? We know the answer, and it is not always yes. But the not coming is not indifference. It is the mathematics of distance and condition, the physics of water and cold, the arithmetic of time. Help tried. It is worth knowing that help tried. It tried at the cost of its own safety and at the edge of its own capability. And some of the trying came too late, and that is a sorrow that the coast has carried since that morning and will carry as long as the coast remembers anything at all. Let yourself breathe. The story is not over. There is more to tell, and it will come to you slowly in the way of water finding its level without urgency. The sea is far away tonight. The shore is solid beneath everything, and you are here, and you are safe, and the cold is nowhere near you. 37 people survived the Valencia disaster. 136 did not. Of the survivors, the majority were male crew members, which reflects the unfortunate but persistent reality of maritime disaster, in which the evacuation of lifeboats in the early 20th century prioritized neither women and children as consistently as the popular history of the era suggests, nor anyone else in particular, but was largely determined by who was closest to the boats, who was physically strongest, and who had the luck to be in the right place at the right moment. The survivors were recovered from several locations. Some were pulled from the water near the ship, some were found on the rocks below the cliffs, some had made it up the life-saving trail to the Carmana lighthouse. A few were recovered from lifeboats that had come ashore on various beaches of Vancouver Island in the hours and days after the wreck. Each of these survivors carried a version of the story that was specific to where they had been and what they had seen, and the accumulation of these partial accounts would occupy the investigators for months. The investigation was conducted by the Dominion Government of Canada, which had jurisdiction over the wreck site, with cooperation from American maritime authorities, since the Valencia was an American-flagged vessel. The investigators interviewed survivors, examined the wreck site from boats when conditions allowed, reviewed the Valencia's charts and logs, those that had been recovered, and attempted to construct a coherent narrative from a collection of contradictory, traumatized, incomplete testimonies. The first thing the investigators established was the navigational error, that the Valencia had been significantly misplaced in her captain's estimation, and that this misplacement was the proximate cause of the grounding. This finding was not controversial. It was clear from the physical evidence, where the ship actually was compared to where the charts said the captain believed himself to be, that a significant error in dead reckoning had occurred. The investigators accepted that this error was not the result of negligence in the usual sense, but of the conditions of coastal navigation in 1906. The second thing the investigators examined was the conduct of the rescue. This is where the testimony became more tangled, and where the questions that would haunt the Valencia story for generations began to emerge. Multiple survivors described seeing lifeboats from the shore approach the Valencia during the night and morning of the disaster, and then turn away. This claim, if true, was explosive. If boats had come close enough to see the survivors and had not taken them off, the question of why they had turned away needed to be answered. The captains of the Queen and the city of Topeka maintained that sea conditions had made approach to the wreck impossible. The lifeboat crews from the shore stations maintained similarly that the surf had prevented close approach. Survivors in the rigging, who had watched from their vantage point, maintained that boats had come close enough to take people off and had not done so. These accounts cannot all be simultaneously correct, and sorting out where the truth lay, in the assessment of the rescuers or in the perception of the rescued, was one of the central challenges of the investigation. There is a particular kind of perceptual distortion that occurs in extreme circumstances. People under stress perceive distances differently. They perceive time differently. They perceive the intentions of others differently. A boat that is 100 yards away and cannot safely come closer looks, from the rigging of a sinking ship, like a boat that could come closer and is choosing not to. The distinction between cannot and will not is one that is very difficult to establish from a distance, in the dark, in the cold, with the surf making communication impossible. Several survivors gave accounts that were particularly detailed and particularly vivid. A man named Frank Lairn, one of the crew members who had survived by getting ashore, described in considerable detail the sequence of events on the ship in the hours after the grounding. He talked about the lifeboats, about which ones got away and which did not, about the behaviour of various officers and crew members, about the conduct of the captain in the hours before and after the grounding. His testimony was one of the most complete available to the investigators, and it was also one of the most contested, with other survivors disputing various elements of his account. A woman named Mrs. Tully survived the disaster and gave an account that was particularly noted for its emotional precision. She had been in the rigging through the night and into the morning, held by her husband. She described the cold with a specificity that made the investigators uncomfortable. the specific quality of the cold that moved from sensation into something else, into a dulling that she recognized as dangerous and fought against by talking and moving and singing, quietly, to herself. Her husband did not survive. She did not explain in her testimony what that was like, and no investigator asked her to. The testimony of the surviving crew members about the behaviour of the lifeboats was particularly disputed. Several accounts described lifeboat crews who had got their boats away from the ship, and then, in the face of the conditions, declined to return. This accusation, that the crew had saved themselves while passengers remained on the ship, was the most serious one to emerge from the investigation, and the one that would have the most lasting effect on the reputation of the Pacific Coast Steamship Company. The investigators concluded cautiously that the evidence did not support a finding of deliberate abandonment, but that the management of the lifeboats had been disorganized and that the training and preparation of the crew for emergency procedures had been inadequate. This was a finding that fell short of blame while acknowledging fault, which is a very particular kind of official language, the kind used when the truth is too complicated or too painful to say directly. For the survivors themselves, the investigation was in many ways beside the point. They knew what they had seen and what they had experienced. The official findings mattered for legal purposes, for the lawsuits that followed, for the regulatory changes that were eventually implemented, for the assignment of responsibility in the abstract. But the survivors lived with something that official findings cannot address: the knowledge of having been there and having gotten out, and the understanding that the difference between them and those who did not get out was often simply a matter of chance. Survivor's guilt is a phrase that would not have been available to the Valencia survivors in 1906. The psychological vocabulary for it was not yet developed. But the condition was there, identifiable in retrospect in the accounts and in the subsequent histories of the people who lived. Several survivors gave multiple interviews over the years, returning to the story again and again in a way that suggests they were still trying to understand it, still trying to metabolize what they had seen. Some of them never spoke about it publicly at all. Some changed their names. Some moved away from the coast and never returned to the sea. The story did different things to different people, as stories of this kind always do. Some people are worn smooth by them, like stones in a river, and some are broken, and some carry them in a way that is difficult to describe but impossible to miss if you know to look. The 37 who survived the Valencia carried the ship with them for the rest of their lives. She was in them the way the cold gets into the body, not in any single place but everywhere, a quality of the interior rather than of the surface, and in the years after, when the investigations were done and the lawsuits were settled and the regulatory changes were implemented, and the Valencia was mostly forgotten by the general public, those 37 people still knew. They knew what it had been like in the rigging. They knew what the shore had looked like from 50 yards of impossible water. They knew the sound of the surf on that particular night, in that particular way that they would carry for the rest of their lives. The formal investigation into the loss of the SS Valencia was conducted under the authority of the Dominion of Canada, with the American Bureau of Navigation also conducting parallel inquiries on the American side. The Canadian inquiry opened in Victoria in February 1906, while the wreck of the Valencia was still visible on the reef, while some of the survivors were still recovering from their injuries, while the families of the lost were still waiting for news of bodies that in many cases would never be recovered. Investigations of maritime disasters in the early 20th century operated with a certain set of procedural constraints that would be foreign to modern practice. The technology for preserving evidence was limited. Photographs existed, but they required physical presence and favourable conditions to take, and the conditions around the wreck site for the first weeks were not favourable. The ship's logs, the most important documentary evidence in any maritime investigation, had been partially recovered, but some had been lost with the wreck. Witnesses were interviewed in sequence rather than simultaneously, which meant that later witnesses had often heard the accounts of earlier ones, creating the possibility of contamination that investigators were aware of but could not entirely guard against. The central question before the Canadian inquiry was not whether the ship had been lost, that was obvious, but why she had been lost and whether anyone bore legal or moral responsibility for the loss. The navigational error was established early and was not contested. The more difficult questions concerned the conduct of the rescue, the lifeboats that had not returned, the ships that had stood off, the shore parties that had been unable to get a line to the rigging. The captain, Oscar Johnson, survived. He had been among those who got off the ship, and his survival in the face of the loss of the majority of his passengers was something that the investigation and the public had to navigate carefully. Under maritime law and tradition, the captain of a ship in distress is expected to remain with the ship until all passengers and crew are evacuated or until the ship is lost. Johnson had not done this. He was among the survivors, which meant he had left while others were still aboard. Whether this constituted a violation of duty was a question the investigation examined closely. Johnson's testimony was that he had done everything in his power to organise the evacuation of the ship, that he had remained as long as it was possible to remain, and that his eventual departure had not been a choice, so much as a wave taking the decision out of his hands. Other survivors disputed elements of this account. The investigation could not resolve the conflict definitively. Johnson was not criminally charged. He did lose his master's certificate, which was the maritime regulatory equivalent of a finding that his conduct had been professionally inadequate, if not criminally culpable. The Pacific Coast Steamship Company faced lawsuits from the families of those who had died. The legal proceedings that followed the Valencia disaster were complex and protracted, in the way of maritime litigation in that era. The company argued that the disaster was the result of an unforeseeable navigational error combined with sea conditions that made rescue impossible. The plaintiffs argued that the company's ship had been inadequately equipped, that the crew had been inadequately trained, and that the rescue efforts had been inadequate. Both sides had evidence. Both sides had arguments. The settlements that eventually resulted were modest by modern standards, which was typical of the era. The regulatory changes that emerged from the Valencia investigation were more significant than the legal outcomes. The disaster helped focus attention on several problems in Pacific coastal navigation that were already known to exist but had not been addressed with sufficient urgency. The adequacy of the life-saving infrastructure along the Vancouver Island coast was examined. The spacing of lighthouses and the capabilities of shore-based life-saving stations were reviewed. The standards for crew training and emergency procedures were scrutinised. The West Coast Trail, the hiking trail that follows the southern shore of Vancouver Island, owes its existence partly to the Valencia disaster and the series of maritime catastrophes that preceded it. The Dominion Life-Saving Trail, as it was originally called, was improved and extended in the years after 1906, creating a continuous passable route along the coast that allowed both rescue workers to reach wreck sites and survivors to make their way to safety. Today, thousands of hikers walk that trail every summer, and most of them know something of the Valencia, because the trail interpretive signs make a point of telling the story. The wreck itself remained on the reef. The surf and the currents worked on the Valencia over the months and years after the disaster, gradually dismantling what the grounding had not immediately destroyed. Iron is more durable than wood, and the hull structure lasted for some time on the rocks. Salvagers made attempts on the Valencia in the months after the wreck, recovering some cargo and some of the ship's fittings, but the location was difficult and the sea conditions were usually unfavourable, and the effort eventually ceased. The investigation closed, the lawsuits settled, the regulatory changes were implemented, the Valencia entered the record as one of the worst maritime disasters on the Pacific coast, a landmark in the history of this stretch of ocean that would be referenced by every subsequent investigation of a coastal wreck for decades. Her name appeared in official documents and newspaper accounts and maritime histories, always in the company of numbers: 164 souls aboard, 37 survivors, 137 lost. In Victoria and in the coastal communities of Vancouver Island, the disaster was felt, in the way that local disasters are felt, personally, specifically, through the names of people who are known or connected to people who are known. This is different from how a disaster is felt when you read about it in a newspaper in a distant city. The newspaper gives you numbers and a narrative. The local experience gives you faces and voices and the particular quality of the grief of people who knew the people who are now numbers in a newspaper. The months after the disaster were a time of reckoning and slowly of moving on. Moving on is not forgetting. Moving on is the process by which life, which must continue, continues. The families of those who were lost moved through that process at different speeds and with different degrees of success. Some never arrived at a comfortable relationship with what had happened. Some did. Most found some middle ground between carrying the loss and being free of it, which is the usual human arrangement. And then the years passed. The Valencia settled into the geological record of the coast, a datum, a reference point, a name on a list. New ships went down, new investigations were conducted, new regulations were written, and some of them were lost again, and some of them held. The Pacific coast continued to be what it had always been, beautiful and cold and entirely indifferent to the small human enterprises that moved across its surface. 20 years passed, 30 years were coming, and then, in a quiet cove on the shore of Vancouver Island, something was found that brought the Valencia back, not as a datum or a reference, but as a presence, a thing with weight and age and the smell of old wood. The investigation had not accounted for everything. Not everything that belonged to the Valencia had been found in the months after the disaster. One thing in particular had not been found. And when it was found at last, 27 years after the ship went down, in conditions that should have been impossible, the questions began again, and some of them have never stopped. If you're still with me, take a slow breath. The night is half over and the best part of the story is still ahead. If you enjoy these long, slow journeys through history and mystery, subscribe. The next story will be waiting for you when you wake. In 1933, 27 years after the Valencia went down, a seal hunter working the coast of Vancouver Island found something in a small sheltered cove near the Broken Group Islands. What he found was a lifeboat. Not a new lifeboat, not a lifeboat that had recently washed in from some other wreck. An old lifeboat, weathered and bleached by decades of salt air, but structurally intact, still floating, still holding its shape. Inside the boat, sheltered from the weather by the boat's own hull, the interior was dry. The number on the boat, faded but still legible, identified it as belonging to the SS Valencia. Think about what that means for a moment. A wooden lifeboat from a 1906 shipwreck still floating and dry on the inside, discovered in 1933. 27 years in the water, or not in the water but somewhere. 27 years of Pacific winters. 27 years of salt spray and UV exposure and the slow biological work of marine organisms on organic materials. And at the end of those 27 years, a boat that could be identified, that was structurally coherent, that was dry inside. The discovery was reported to the maritime authorities and published in the Victoria newspapers, and it created a stir that reached well beyond the usual interest in old maritime stories. The Valencia had been a significant disaster even in 1906. And its memory was still alive in coastal British Columbia in 1933. People who had been young at the time of the wreck were now middle-aged or old. Some survivors were still living. The families of those who'd been lost were still there, still in the communities where the disaster had registered as a local tragedy. The lifeboat was examined. It was indeed from the Valencia. The identification was not in doubt. The condition of the boat prompted immediate questions. How had it survived? Where had it been? The answers that emerged were partial and speculative, and they were interesting enough to generate a second round of investigation and newspaper coverage that revisited the original disaster in the light of this new discovery. The most plausible explanation for the lifeboat's survival involves geography and ocean currents, and a degree of good fortune that borders on the uncanny. The Broken Group Islands, a cluster of small islands in Berkeley Sound, on the western coast of Vancouver Island, include numerous small coves and inlets, where a floating object, once lodged, might remain sheltered from the open ocean for extended periods. The islands themselves provide protection from the prevailing swells. A boat that found its way into such a cove and lodged there could conceivably remain afloat and relatively protected for years. This is, in outline, the explanation that the investigators of 1933 settled on. The lifeboat, they believed, had got away from the Valencia during the disaster, either launched successfully or torn free by the surf, and had drifted or been carried by the currents into a position where it eventually lodged in a sheltered cove. Once lodged, it had remained. The cove was not frequented. The seal hunters who occasionally worked that part of the coast might not have noticed it, or had noticed it and not recognized its significance, or had noticed it and not reported it, for any of the dozen reasons that people do not report things. What was the condition of the interior? The accounts from 1933 describe an interior that was dry and relatively clean, not pristine, not undamaged by the passage of decades, but recognizably the interior of a lifeboat rather than a piece of marine debris. The bench seats were present, the oarlocks were present. Various pieces of equipment that a properly equipped lifeboat of 1906 would carry were described as being still present in some form, The wood was weathered and bleached as you would expect, but it had not been compromised structurally. What was not in the lifeboat was what made the discovery strange, or rather, what was not in the lifeboat was what made the discovery haunting. The Valencia had had 6 lifeboats. The accounts from the disaster described at least some of these boats being launched with people in them. Some of these people had been recovered, some had not. The question that the 1933 discovery immediately prompted was, had this particular lifeboat carried anyone? And if so, what had become of them? There was no evidence in the boat of recent occupation. No clothing, no bones, no personal effects of the kind that survivors or their bodies would have left behind. The boat appeared to have drifted or lodged empty. Either it had been launched empty, or it had carried people who had left it or been taken from it before it reached its final resting place. The investigators of 1933 could not determine which of these possibilities was the correct one. The boat could not tell them. The haunted quality of the discovery lay precisely in this silence. A dry lifeboat from a 1906 disaster, found in 1933, with no explanation of where it had been or what it had carried. It was a blank in the record, a space where a story should be, but was not. Maritime history is full of such blanks. Ships lost without trace, lifeboats found empty, the sea giving back things without explanation. But the Valencia lifeboat was particularly striking because of the combination of its age, its condition, and its identification. Some people, in 1933, speculated that the lifeboat had carried survivors who had made it to shore somewhere along the Vancouver Island coast, and had either died there or survived there, and, for whatever reason, had never been found or reported. This speculation was romantic and mostly dismissed by those who had examined the actual evidence. But it was not entirely without basis. The coast of western Vancouver Island in 1906 was sparsely inhabited, and in places almost entirely inaccessible. A small group of people coming ashore in a remote cove, in the state of hypothermia and shock that would be expected of Valencia survivors, might conceivably have failed to make it to any inhabited place. This possibility, that there were survivors of the Valencia who were never accounted for, who died on the coast of Vancouver Island or lived there briefly and died there, is one that cannot be definitively ruled out even now. It is one of the holes in the story that has never been filled. The official survivor count is 37. Whether that number is exactly right, or whether it is missing some people who got away from the ship in ways that were not observed and recorded, is a question that the 1933 discovery put back on the table, and that has never been entirely removed from it. The lifeboat was taken to Victoria, examined, and eventually either destroyed or lost from the record. The accounts of what finally happened to it are not consistent. It does not appear to have been preserved as a museum artifact, which is a loss of a different kind. The physical evidence, had it been kept, might have yielded information unavailable to the investigators of 1933. But 1933 was not an era much given to the preservation of maritime artifacts, and the lifeboat was old and weathered and not particularly impressive to look at, and it was disposed of in whatever way such things were disposed of then. What it left behind was the question of where it had been and what it had carried, and what the months and years between January 1906 and whenever it found its cove had looked like. The sea does not answer these questions. It simply holds them, as it holds everything, the wrecks, the bodies, the lifeboats, in its enormous, indifferent, imperfect memory. The fishermen who found the lifeboat in 1933 were not treasure hunters. They were not looking for history. They were working, as fishermen always work, moving through the channels of the broken group islands with the pragmatic attention of people whose livelihood depends on reading the water correctly. When something unusual presents itself to that kind of attention, it is noticed not as a mystery, but as a fact. There is a boat here, in this cove, that has no obvious business being here. The fact is registered. Questions come later, if at all. The reporting of the discovery moved slowly through the channels available in 1933. Local newspapers, maritime authorities, eventually the historical record. There was no immediate sensation. The Valencia disaster was 27 years old. The people who had lived through it were in their 40s and 50s, if they were alive at all. The families of those who had been lost had long since moved through the acute phase of grief and into the long, quieter phase that grief eventually becomes. The discovery of the lifeboat reopened something gently, the way a piece of music reopens a memory. Not sharply, not painfully, but with a particular quality of recognition. There is something worth considering in the condition of that boat. Dry inside, intact, the wood not rotted. A lifeboat is not built to last indefinitely in any environment. It is built to last long enough to get a small group of people from a sinking ship to a place where they can be rescued. 27 years is not the design specification. And yet, there it was, in the quiet water of its cove, intact enough to be identified and reported. The sea had kept it. The particular geography of the Broken Group Islands had kept it, and now it was found, which is a kind of ending and also a kind of beginning. There is a tradition in maritime culture of remembering the dead in a particular way, not with monuments in town squares, though there are those too, but with the act of watching the water. The families of sailors and fishermen and coastal workers have always gone to the shore when something is lost at sea, not because it helps, not because looking at the water accomplishes anything practical, but because the water is where the thing happened, and looking at it is the closest available approximation of being present to it. It is a form of witness. The families of those lost on the Valencia went to the shore. Some of them, in the months after the disaster, walked the beaches of Vancouver Island looking for bodies that the sea might have returned. The sea is not reliable in this regard. It gives back some things and not others, on a schedule that has no relationship to human need or human grief. Some bodies were recovered in the days and weeks after the disaster. Others were never found. The sea has them still, wherever the currents and the depths have taken them. In the years after the Valencia, the stretch of coast where she went down became a kind of pilgrimage site. Not formally, not officially, but in the way that places where terrible things happened become sites of informal visitation. People came to see. People came to think. People came with questions that the place could not answer, but that they needed to ask in the presence of the place rather than somewhere else. This is a very old human behaviour. It predates organised religion. It is the basic instinct to go to where the thing happened and stand there. The lightkeepers at Camana Point were the custodians of this stretch of coast in the years after the Valencia. They lived there year-round, tending the light that had not been able to warn the Valencia in time, maintaining the logbooks that recorded the passage of ships and the character of the weather, and the occasional wrecks that occurred despite the light's existence. Their lives were isolated and their routine was precise and repetitive, and the story of the Valencia was part of the background of their existence in the way that history is part of the background of places where history happened. What does it mean to live beside a place where many people died? The lighthouse keepers of Camana were not unique in this. People live beside battlefields, beside sites of floods and fires and all the other ways that disaster marks a landscape. The living relationship to such a place is not one of constant grief. It is more like a weight that you carry without thinking about it most of the time, that you become aware of on certain days, in certain kinds of weather, when the quality of the light or the sound of the water is particularly like what it must have been on the day that gave the place its history. The Nucha Nulth people who had lived on this coast for thousands of years had their own relationship to the water and to the things that happened on it. Their knowledge of the coast, its currents, its dangers, its sheltered places, was extensive and precise, accumulated over hundreds of generations of living beside it, and on it, and from it. After the Valencia disaster, some of the accounts collected by investigators referenced the assistance provided by members of local, indigenous communities in the rescue efforts. This assistance was real and significant, though it was underreported in the official accounts, which tended to focus on the actions of the official rescue apparatus. The oral traditions of the Nucha Nulth include accounts of the Valencia disaster that differ in character from the official accounts, not in their basic factual outline, but in their quality of attention and their relationship to the place. These accounts situate the disaster within a longer history of the coast, a history that does not begin with European navigation and does not end with it. The sea in these accounts is not merely a geographic feature, but an active presence, something with agency, something that has relationships with the living and the dead. The question of what the sea remembers, if memory is even the right word for what the sea does, is one that coastal cultures have thought about in various ways. The sea keeps things, the wrecks, the bodies, the artifacts, the chemistry of the creatures that have lived in it. It also changes things. The wrecks corrode, the bodies dissolve, The artifacts are altered by pressure and salt and time. What the sea returns is always changed by its time in the water. A lifeboat returned after 27 years is not the same lifeboat that was launched. It has been altered by exposure, by biological processes, by the passage of time in salt water and salt air. It is a version of itself, carrying information about where it has been in the form of its condition. The discovery of the lifeboat in 1933 prompted renewed interest in the Valencia disaster, and some of that interest expressed itself as an interest in the physical remains of the wreck. The Valencia's hull, or the portions of it that remained identifiable, was still on the reef, or rather portions of it were scattered across the reef and the surrounding area, where the surf and the currents had distributed them over the years. Divers had been to the site and would continue to visit it. The wreck was known to the diving community as an interesting historical site, though not an easy one. The conditions that had wrecked the ship continued to make the site difficult to work in. What do divers find at the Valencia wreck site today? The iron of the hull has corroded significantly, as iron always does in salt water, but iron corrodes slowly and pieces of the structure remain. The reef itself is identifiable. The orientation of the wreck in relation to the reef matches the accounts of the survivors. Standing at the wreck site on a calm day, and there are calm days, even on this coast, even in winter sometimes, you can reconstruct the geography of the disaster. Here is where the ship struck. Here is where the bow lifted. Here is the line of the shore. Here is the distance to the land that was visible from the rigging. The distance, in good conditions, is measurable and not large. Standing on the reef and looking at the shore is an exercise in a particular kind of historical understanding, the kind that comes from being in the place rather than reading about it, that makes the events of the past concrete in a way that description cannot quite achieve. The shore is close. It has always been close. The 50 or 75 yards of water between the Valencia and the land is visually nothing, spatially trivial, and was in January 1906 an impassable gulf. The people who go to the West Coast Trail today, the hikers who work their way along the southern shore of Vancouver Island, through the old growth and the ferns and the mud, pass through the territory of the Valencia disaster. The trail interpretive signs explain the history. The remains of the old life-saving infrastructure are visible in places. The cable car systems, the telegraph poles, the patrol cabins. The coast itself is unchanged in its essential character. Still beautiful, still remote, still capable in the right conditions of the same combination of fog and surf and cold that made January 1906 what it was. The Valencia is in the landscape of that coast the way old wrecks are always in the landscapes of the coasts they belong to. Not visible exactly, not obvious, but present, underlying. The way that the bedrock underlies the soil, the way that the history of a place underlies its present. You don't see it when you look, but you are always walking on it. And somewhere in the record, and the accumulated accounts and testimonies and newspaper stories and investigation findings and the memories of people who were there and the stories they told to people who weren't, the Valencia persists. Not as a disaster, not primarily, but as a question. The lifeboat is the centre of the question. It is the detail that does not resolve. It is the thing that came back after 27 years dry and unexplained and opened the record again. What stories does the sea keep that it never returns? What happened in the hours and days after the disaster in the waters and on the shores that no official account recorded? The sea is quiet on these questions. It always has been. It probably always will be. Let us return to the night of January 4th and 5th, 1906, and look at the lifeboats. Not at the broad fact of them, that they were there, that some were launched, that some were lost, but at the specific accounts of what happened to each one. This is the part of the Valencia story that the investigation spent the most time on and resolved the least satisfactorily, and it is the part that matters most to understanding the 1933 lifeboat discovery. The Valencia carried 6 wooden lifeboats plus life rafts. The lifeboats were of the design standard for coastal vessels of the early 20th century, clinker-built, meaning constructed with overlapping planks, double-ended, fitted with oarlocks and oars and a small sail, and the basic survival equipment required by the regulations of the era. They were not large boats. A standard coastal steamer lifeboat of this period could carry perhaps 20 to 30 people, depending on conditions. Lifeboat number 1 was apparently launched early in the disaster and carried a number of crew members. Its fate is unclear in the accounts. Some testimony suggests it made it to shore. Other testimony describes seeing it swamped in the surf. The investigators could not determine definitively what happened to lifeboat number 1 because the accounts were too contradictory and because the physical evidence, the boat itself, or identifiable portions of it, was never recovered. Lifeboat number 2 presented a similar accounting problem. It was launched, it carried people, it went into the surf, and after that its story diverged into multiple contradictory accounts that could not be reconciled. Whether this was because different witnesses saw different portions of the boat's voyage, or because the conditions that night made accurate observation impossible, or because some of the witnesses were simply wrong in their recollections, cannot be established now. Lifeboat number 3 was the one most clearly associated with a successful shore landing, or at least a partial success. The accounts describe this boat reaching the rocks below the cliffs, and some of its occupants making it to shore. The people who made it to shore from this boat were among the survivors. They were the ones who then had to climb the cliff face and make their way to the life-saving trail, which they did in the dark, in January, soaking wet and hypothermic, which is one of the more remarkable physical achievements embedded in the Valencia story. Lifeboats 4, 5 and 6 are accounted for differently in different sources. The investigation's best reconstruction suggests that at least one of the remaining boats was destroyed in the attempt to launch it, caught by a wave against the side of the ship, or lowered unevenly and swamped. Another appears to have gotten away and may have drifted north with the prevailing current. And one boat, for which the accounting in the official record is the least complete, appears to have been launched, to have carried some number of people, and then to have simply not been found. The boat found in 1933, number 5 or 6, depending on the numbering system in use, the accounts differ slightly, is the one for which the accounting is least complete. This is the detail that matters. Not that a lifeboat from the Valencia was found 27 years later, in a condition that defied easy explanation, but that this particular lifeboat was the one whose fate had never been satisfactorily accounted for in the original investigation. If the lifeboat had been launched empty, torn from its davits by the surf or launched as a precaution without passengers, then its long drift to a sheltered cove is strange but not deeply mysterious. Boats without cargo or passengers float higher and are more susceptible to wind and current. A light, empty boat could conceivably travel significant distances before grounding somewhere. The 27 years are still difficult to account for, but the geography of the Broken Group Islands, with their numerous small protected coves, provides at least a framework for a natural explanation. If the lifeboat had been launched with people in it, then the question of where those people went is one that the 1933 discovery reopens with some urgency. The boat was dry inside. This means either that it had not been in the open sea for 27 years, that it had been sheltered for most or all of that time, or that its construction was so sound and its position so protected that weather had not been able to get into it. Either interpretation creates questions rather than answering them. Who might the boat have carried? If we take seriously the possibility that it was launched with passengers, then those passengers were among the people unaccounted for in the Valencia disaster. People whose bodies were never recovered. People whose last known location was on the ship at some point during the night of January 4th and 5th. Given the chaos of the disaster, given the darkness and the surf and the confusion of the evacuation, it is entirely possible that a boat was launched with some number of people in it, and that what happened to those people was observed by no one who subsequently survived to testify about it. The imagination goes where it naturally goes, to a boat full of people, in the dark, in the surf off the rocks of Vancouver Island. The cold, the darkness, the sound of the ship behind them and the sound of the surf ahead. The oars trying to keep the bow into the waves. The coast probably visible if the fog had cleared, the dark mass of it against the slightly lighter dark of the sky. What would those people have been saying to each other, or not saying? What would they have been thinking about in the part of the mind that keeps working even when the situation has moved past the point where thinking helps? These are not questions that can be answered. They are questions that arise from the blank in the record and that the blank in the record will never fill. The lifeboat came back empty, or empty seeming without explanation, after 27 years, and the explanation it did not provide is the thing that matters. It is possible, it is more than possible, it is probable, that the boat was launched empty and drifted and lodged and remained. It is possible that the dry interior is simply the result of its position in the sheltered cove, protected from rain and spray by the surrounding rocks. These explanations are adequate. They fit the available facts. They do not require anything mysterious. But they do require a particular kind of luck. The luck of an empty boat finding precisely the right protected cove, entering it in precisely the right way, sitting at precisely the right angle to remain afloat for 27 Pacific winters. This is the kind of luck that is statistically possible, but that the mind has difficulty accepting as ordinary. It feels like the sea is trying to say something. It feels like the coast is keeping a secret, and the coast, which has been keeping secrets since the first ships came around Cape Flattery, offers nothing further on the subject. The lifeboat was examined, photographed in some accounts, and eventually lost from the record. The sea kept its explanations. The investigation found nothing conclusive, and the ghost boat of the Valencia passed back into the status of story, part of the disaster's long aftermath, part of the coast's accumulated mystery, part of the question that this particular stretch of ocean has always posed to anyone who comes to it with a question it cannot answer. There is an accounting question embedded in the lifeboat problem that the record has never fully resolved. 6 lifeboats are mentioned in various testimonies and reports. Some are accounted for, launched, swamped, found empty near the wreck site, recovered in the days after the disaster with bodies or without. But the accounting does not add up cleanly, partly because the witnesses did not agree, partly because the boats themselves were not always distinguishable from one another in the chaos and the dark, and partly because the sea is not an environment that preserves clear records. What can be said with reasonable confidence is that the lifeboat found in 1933 had been at sea, or at least somewhere on the water, for 27 years, and that no one had seen it or reported it in all that time. The Broken Group Islands, where the boat was found, lie roughly 60 nautical miles northeast of the Valencia wreck site. 60 miles is not an enormous distance, but it is not a short one either, and the route between the wreck and the islands passes through some of the most complex tidal waters on the coast. For a drifting, unmanned boat to make that passage without being spotted, without grounding, without swamping, and without breaking apart requires a combination of conditions that most mariners would describe as improbable. Improbable is not impossible. The sea produces improbable things with some regularity, but improbable is worth noting. What the lifeboat did during those 27 years, whether it drifted, whether it was trapped in some back eddy of the islands, whether it was observed and not reported, whether it was used and returned, whether it simply found its cove early and stayed there, these things cannot be determined. The boat carried no log, it left no trail. It arrived in the place where it was found, and that place is all there is. There is a word used for what the Valencia has become to the coast of British Columbia: haunting. It is used loosely, the way haunting is always used when applied to a place rather than a ghost. Not literally, not with any serious claim to the supernatural, but as a description of a quality of presence that the physical facts of the disaster have left in the landscape and in the culture of the coast. The Valencia haunts this stretch of ocean, the way all great maritime disasters haunt their coasts, by remaining in the stories, in the names of places, in the character of the institutions that were changed by it. Maritime disasters create their own geography. The names of the ships become attached to the places where they went down, or to the broader stretch of coast associated with them, and these names persist in the language long after the ships themselves are forgotten by all but historians. The Titanic gave her name to an entire discourse about hubris and inadequate lifeboats. The Edmund Fitzgerald gave hers to a Gordon Lightfoot song. The Valencia gave hers to a set of regulatory changes and a stretch of trail, and a particular quality of attention that the coast of Vancouver Island pays to the fog, which is to say an extra carefulness, an extra awareness of what the fog can hide. The West Coast Trail, as it is now called, is one of the most famous hiking trails in Canada. It runs along the southern shore of Vancouver Island for about 75 kilometres, through old-growth forest and along cliff tops above the Pacific, through terrain that is extraordinarily beautiful, and that has, in its beauty, an undertone of the history that made it. The trail exists because ships went down. The infrastructure of the trail, the cable car crossings of the river gorges, the boardwalks through the swamps, the ladders up and down the cliff faces, was developed partly for hikers, but was built originally for a very different purpose. The hikers who walk the West Coast Trail today are, in a sense, walking in the footsteps of the survivors and would-be rescuers of the Valencia and the other ships that went down on this coast. The terrain they cross is the terrain that made rescue so difficult. The distances they cover in a week of hiking are the distances that people in January 1906, soaking wet and hypothermic, had to cover to reach help or to provide it. The physical reality of the trail makes the disaster comprehensible in a way that reading about it cannot quite achieve. There are people who specifically go to the West Coast Trail because of the Valencia. Some of them are historians and maritime researchers. Some are descendants of survivors or of those who were lost. Some are simply people drawn to the specific kind of places where history happened in a concentrated way. Places where the past is present in the landscape, where you can stand in the geography of events that changed things. These people walk the trail and read the interpretive signs and look out at the water from the cliff tops and try to see what it must have looked like from the rigging of a ship in trouble, which is an impossible act of imagination, but one that people attempt anyway. The Pachena Bay area, near where the Valencia went down, has a small monument that marks the disaster. It is not elaborate, a plaque, a location, some text that gives the basic facts, but it is there, and it is visited, and the visitors stand at it and look out at the water and do what visitors to such places always do. Try to feel the weight of what happened there. This is a strange thing to want to do, and yet it is universal. The desire to be in the physical presence of significant events, even terrible ones, is one of the more consistent human behaviours. What do you feel standing at such a place? There is the beauty of it first. The coast is genuinely beautiful, in the way of wild and difficult places. The old-growth forest comes right to the edge of the cliffs. The rocks below are complex and interesting, carved by millennia of surf into shapes that are geological but feel almost architectural. The water beyond the rocks is the deep grey-green of the Pacific in winter light. It is a beautiful place. And then there is the knowledge of what happened here, which sits alongside the beauty without resolving into it, without being absorbed or neutralized by it. The knowledge that something terrible happened in a beautiful place does not make the place less beautiful. It makes the beauty strange, gives it a quality that beauty without that knowledge does not have. The beauty and the knowledge coexist, and the coexistence is the particular thing about such places. This is what haunting means when it is applied to a landscape. Not that there are ghosts, not that something supernatural is present, but that the knowledge of what happened here is present in the experience of the place, and cannot be set aside without losing something essential about the encounter. The Valencia has been part of the cultural memory of the British Columbia coast for more than 100 years now. The people who were directly affected by it, the survivors, the families of those who died, the communities along the coast that felt it as a local tragedy, are all gone now. What remains is the institutional and cultural memory, the trail, the monument, the regulatory history, the maritime histories, the newspaper archives, the books written about the disaster over the decades since, and the stories. Stories are the most durable form of cultural memory. They do not require institutions to maintain them. They propagate themselves, changing slightly with each telling, adapting to the context of each new audience, losing some details and gaining others, but retaining their essential shape. The ship, the night, the reef, the rigging, the shore so close. The lifeboat found 27 years later, dry inside. These are the elements that make the story persist. They are memorable because they contain both the concrete fact and the unanswerable question. Every story about the Valencia, including this one, is in some sense a continuation of the attempt that survivors began in 1906, the attempt to understand what happened well enough to be at peace with it, or at least to articulate what cannot be understood well enough to put it in a form that can be carried. This is what stories about disasters do. They are not explanations, they are containers, shaped to hold something that cannot be held in any other way. The coast of Vancouver Island continues. The sea is there in the dark, doing what the sea does. The rocks at Pachena Point are wet with spray tonight, as they are most nights, as they have been for thousands of years. The fog comes and goes on its own schedule, indifferent to human schedules. The current runs its way past the cape and into the strait, carrying whatever it carries, water, nutrients, the invisible biological freight of the ocean, on its way to wherever currents go. The Valencia is there too, in the way of wrecks that have become part of the reef, not the ship anymore, not the identifiable structure of a vessel, but iron incorporated into the geology of the site, coral encrusted, silted over in places, broken in others, spread across the rocks in the pattern of the disaster's final geometry. She has been part of the reef for more than a century. She will be part of it for centuries more. And somewhere on Vancouver Island, or in the record of somewhere on Vancouver Island, is the memory of a lifeboat found dry in a sheltered cove in 1933, 27 years after the ship it came from went down. The memory of it is in the newspapers of that year. It is in the maritime histories. It is in this story being told to you now in the dark at whatever hour you are hearing it. The sea does not speak, but it keeps. It keeps the wrecks and the bodies and the artifacts and the questions. It keeps them as it has always kept them, in its own way, at its own depth, on its own schedule. And occasionally, without announcement, it gives something back. The graveyard of the Pacific did not begin with the Valencia and did not end with her. She is one ship in a long list, a significant one, but not the only one worth knowing about. The history of this stretch of coast is the history of the encounter between European and American maritime ambition and the particular physical character of the Pacific Northwest, a character that does not accommodate carelessness and that has tested the limits of even careful navigation for as long as ships have come here. The earliest recorded European contact with this coast dates to the late 18th century, when Spanish, British and American explorers were mapping the Pacific Northwest in a spirit of imperial competition that was also a spirit of genuine curiosity. These explorers came in ships that were not small, they were ocean-going vessels designed for long voyages, and they navigated this coast with the instruments available to the late 18th century, which is to say with considerable skill and considerable uncertainty. The charts they made were the beginning of the navigation that would be used, in improved but not entirely reliable form, by the captains of ships like the Valencia more than a century later. The fur trade era brought regular maritime traffic to the coast from the 1790s onward. The sea otter population of the Pacific Northwest was, by the end of the 18th century, among the most valuable biological resources on the planet. Their pelts commanded extraordinary prices in the Chinese market, and the trade that developed around them brought ships from Boston and New York and London and various other ports to this remote stretch of coastline on a regular basis. These ships were not coastal vessels. They were ocean-going ships crewed by men who knew the Atlantic and the open Pacific, but not necessarily the specific hazards of this particular coast. They learned those hazards the way you learn things you do not know, by making mistakes. Some mistakes were minor, groundings on beaches that turned out to be sandy, navigational errors that were caught in time, weather that was worse than expected but survived. Other mistakes were not minor. Ships were lost. Crews died. The knowledge accumulated in the logs of the survivors and in the charts that were corrected after each new datum was established. But the accumulation was slow and the ocean was patient and ships kept being lost. The gold rushes of the 19th century, the California rush of 1849, the Fraser River rush of 1858, the Klondike rush of 1896, each generated surges of maritime traffic along the Pacific coast. People needed to move quickly from California to the north or vice versa, and the coastal steamers were the fastest and most reliable means available. These surges of traffic happened to coincide with periods when the ships available were being pushed to capacity, when the crews were sometimes underprepared, when the schedules were aggressive and the pressure to maintain them was commercial and relentless. The history of the graveyard of the Pacific is also, in part, a history of the lighthouse system of the Pacific Northwest. The establishment of lighthouses along this coast was a gradual process driven as much by disaster as by foresight, each major wreck creating pressure on the authorities to put a light where there had not been one before. The Camana Lighthouse, which was close to the Valencia wreck site, was established in 1891 after years of advocacy by maritime interests who argued that the southwestern corner of Vancouver Island was one of the most dangerous unlit stretches of coast on the Pacific. The argument was correct, and the lighthouse was built, and it helped, but it did not end the wrecks. The relationship between lighthouses and maritime disasters is a complicated one. A lighthouse reduces the risk of certain kinds of wreck, those caused by a failure to identify a headland or cape in fog or darkness. But it does not eliminate all risk, because not all wrecks are caused by the same failure. The Valencia was not lost because the crew failed to see the Comana lighthouse. She was lost because the captain believed himself to be in a different position than he was, and because the fog and the darkness made visual navigation impossible, and because the specific combination of current and wind that night had pushed the ship closer to shore than the dead reckoning calculations indicated. Each of these factors had been present in various combinations in the wrecks that preceded the Valencia and in the wrecks that followed her. The graveyard of the Pacific is not called that because it has a single cause. It is called that because the coast concentrates risk, physical risk from the geography, meteorological risk from the weather, navigational risk from the combination of fog and current, and the difficulty of fixing position without modern instruments, in a way that makes it consistently, persistently, and unforgivably dangerous to ships that cannot handle that concentration of risk. Modern navigation has changed the equation significantly. GPS makes position fixing trivially easy. Radar allows navigation in zero visibility. Ship-to-shore communication is instantaneous. The weather forecasting available to modern mariners is so much better than what was available in 1906 that it almost seems like a different world. Modern vessels going down on the graveyard of the Pacific are rare, and when they occur, they are usually the result of equipment failure or human error of a particularly dramatic kind rather than the ordinary navigational uncertainty that doomed the Valencia. But the coast itself has not changed. The rocks at Pachina Point are the same rocks. The currents run the same way for the same reasons. The weather comes from the same directions. The fog is the same fog. If you could transport a ship from 1906 to the coast of Vancouver Island today, with 1906 instruments and 1906 charts and 1906 communication equipment, the graveyard would be as dangerous to it as it has always been. The safety is in the instruments, not in the ocean. This is worth knowing, because it puts the Valencia disaster in its proper context. It was not an extraordinary event caused by extraordinary failures. It was an ordinary event, a navigational error in conditions that produce navigational errors regularly, that had extraordinarily bad consequences because of the specific geography of where the error occurred. The same navigational error made 50 miles offshore would have been corrected without drama. Made here, off the southwestern tip of Vancouver Island, it was lethal. The ships that went down before the Valencia on this coast, and there were many, each contributed something to the record of the coast. Each one was investigated to whatever extent investigation was possible with the technology of its era. Each one prompted some adjustment in the system. Another lighthouse, another life-saving station, another set of regulations, another revised chart. The improvements were real. The risk never went to zero. The Valencia was not the last ship lost on this coast. The improvements that her loss prompted were real improvements. The life-saving trail was better. The communication between shore stations was better. The crew training requirements were stricter. The charts were more accurate. All of this mattered. But the coast was still the coast, and ships still came, and the mathematics of risk applied over enough time eventually produces outcomes. The graveyard of the Pacific has a list. The list is long. The Valencia is on it, near the top by several measures, by the number of lives lost, by the subsequent investigation, by the degree to which the disaster affected maritime practice and policy. She's not at the top of the list by the number of lives lost. Other wrecks on other coasts were worse by that measure. But she's near the top by the quality of her persistence in the memory of the coast. This is the thing about the Valencia that all the histories note, even the dry official ones. She stays. She came back in 1933 in the form of a lifeboat. She comes back whenever someone walks the West Coast Trail. She comes back in the fog, in the particular quality of a January morning on the southwestern coast of Vancouver Island. She does not let go of the coast, and the coast does not let go of her. Time does something to disasters that nothing else does. It does not heal them exactly. The word healing implies a return to a prior condition, and disasters do not allow that. What time does instead is transform them, from the hot, immediate presence they are in the days and weeks after they happen into the cooler, more complex presence they become over years and decades, and then into something cooler still, a part of the record, a part of the landscape, a part of the way a place understands itself. The Valencia was in the hot immediate phase for perhaps a year after the disaster. The investigation was conducted in that phase. The lawsuits were filed in it. The newspaper coverage was intense, the public attention was sharp and focused. In this phase, the disaster was a problem that needed to be understood, that needed to be assigned responsibility, that needed to be addressed through regulatory change and legal proceeding and public accountability. Then the phase shifted. The investigation ended, the lawsuits were settled, the regulatory changes were implemented. The public attention moved on to other things, as public attention always does, because the present generates new problems at a rate that does not allow sustained attention to old ones. The Valencia entered the cooler phase, still present in the local consciousness, still referenced in conversations about coastal safety and maritime history, but no longer urgent, no longer requiring action, no longer a crisis. The survivors moved through the phases of their own relationship to the disaster on individual schedules that did not correspond to any institutional timetable. Some of them, as noted, gave multiple interviews over the years, remaining engaged with the story publicly long after it had receded from public attention. Others withdrew from it. The diversity of responses to surviving a catastrophe is one of the more consistent findings of the psychology of trauma, though the language of trauma psychology would not have been available to the Valencia survivors. What did the survivors do with their lives after the Valencia? The records are incomplete, as records of ordinary people's lives always are. Some can be traced through census records and newspaper mentions and family histories. Some became involved in maritime safety advocacy, using their experience and their public profile as survivors to argue for better life-saving infrastructure along the coast. One or two became fishermen or sailors again, returning to the sea in the way that some people return to the things that hurt them because the relationship with those things is too fundamental to abandon. Others moved inland and away from the coast. Frank Lean, whose testimony was among the most detailed in the investigation, remained in Victoria for some years after the disaster. He gave several newspaper interviews over the following decade, each time repeating and elaborating the account he had given to the investigators, with variations that reflect the way memory works over time. Details that become more certain, other details that become less so, the narrative tightening around the elements that have been told most often, and losing precision around the ones that have not. His later interviews have a quality of practiced recitation, mixed with genuine residual emotion, that is characteristic of people who have told a terrible story many times. The families of those who were lost had a different relationship to the aftermath. For them, the investigation and the lawsuits had a practical urgency, financial compensation for the loss of breadwinners, official acknowledgement of what had happened, some form of institutional accountability. The settlements they received were modest, and the official acknowledgement was partial, and the accountability was distributed across so many parties in so many ways that it was difficult to feel that any single party had been truly held responsible. The grief of the families had no official timeline. The investigation ended, the lawsuits settled, the regulatory changes were made. None of these things changed the fundamental fact, which was that the person was gone and would not come back. This fact is the one that all the official processes circle around and cannot address. The Valencia survivors and the families of the dead all came eventually to the same understanding that everyone who has experienced significant loss comes to. The institutional responses to disaster are about the institution, not about the grief, and the grief proceeds according to its own logic regardless of what the institution does. The coast changed, and did not change. The life-saving trail was improved. The telegraph line connecting the coastal stations was upgraded. The lighthouse at Carmona was maintained and eventually modernised. The ships that ran the coastal route were better equipped, their crews better trained. The navigational charts for this stretch of coast were revised and improved. The margin for error along the Vancouver Island shore was not eliminated. It is not possible to eliminate it, but it was widened somewhat. New disasters occurred anyway, because the margin for error being wider does not mean the margin is infinite, and because the sea operates on a timescale that is longer than any human system of improvement. Other ships went onto other rocks, other investigations were conducted, the pattern of disaster and investigation and regulatory improvement and subsequent disaster continued, because it always continues, because the sea is always the sea, and ships are always made and sailed by people who are always, in the ways that matter most, limited. The 1933 discovery of the lifeboat created a momentary flare of renewed interest in the Valencia story. Newspapers in Victoria and Vancouver ran retrospective pieces. Maritime historians dug out their files. People who had been young during the disaster and who were now in their 50s recalled what they remembered. This flare lasted a few weeks, as such flares always do, and then subsided. But the lifeboat discovery had done something to the story that did not entirely subside. It had made the story open-ended in a way that it had not been before. Before 1933, the Valencia disaster had a complete narrative arc. The ship went down, most people died, survivors testified, investigation found what it could, regulations changed, closure. After 1933, the narrative arc had an appendix, something that came back from the disaster after 27 years, unexplained, and reopened the question of what the disaster had actually contained. Stories with open endings persist differently than stories with closed ones. A story that ends cleanly, everyone accounted for, all questions answered, all mysteries resolved, is finished. A story with an unresolved element is not finished. It remains available to each new generation as a problem to be worked, a question to be asked again, a mystery to be approached from new angles with new information. The Valencia became, after 1933, a story with an unresolved element, and unresolved elements in stories are the seeds of persistence. The decades passed. The world changed enormously around the unchanged coast. The technologies of navigation changed. The technologies of communication changed. The political geography of the Pacific Northwest changed in ways that would have been unrecognizable to anyone in 1906. The boats that work the coastal waters changed, and yet the water was the same water, and the rocks were the same rocks, and the fog came and went in the same indifferent way it always had. In the long aftermath of the Valencia, the coast and the disaster continued to keep each other company, in the way of things that are permanently associated, the way a name stays attached to a place, the way a date stays attached to an event, the way the smell of something stays attached to a memory that is otherwise inaccessible. The Valencia is in the coast the way the cold is in the water, not visible, not a surface quality but fundamental, always there, a condition of the thing itself. The disaster produced changes that were implemented slowly and incompletely, as is usually the case when institutions respond to catastrophe. Lifeboat requirements were revised, but the revisions were argued over for years before they became standard. Radio requirements for coastal vessels were discussed, debated, deferred. The particular combination of fog and rocky coast and limited communication that had made the Valencia disaster so deadly was recognized as a systemic problem, and the response to systemic problems is systemic change, which is slow and resistible in ways that individual responses are not. 100 years after the Valencia, the West Coast Trail, established partly in direct response to the disaster, a life-saving trail cut through the forest to give shipwreck survivors a route to safety, had become one of the most popular wilderness hiking routes in Canada. People walk it every summer, 50 kilometers of coastal forest and headland, and most of them know something about the Valencia. The trail is the disaster's most visible legacy, a physical record of the recognition that this coast was dangerous and that people caught on it deserved a way out. The Valencia gave them that trail. It was not what anyone wanted to give or receive. The long aftermath of any disaster is the accumulation of changes made in response to it, some of which outlast the memory of the disaster itself. Future generations use life-saving equipment they do not know was designed in response to a specific catastrophe. They walk trails without knowing why the trails were built. They board ferries that have more lifeboats than they need for ordinary purposes, and they do not think about Valencia, because the thinking was done long ago and the result was the boat on its davits, ready, available, which is the only form in which that thinking now exists. There is a moment in every night, if you are awake to catch it, when the quality of the dark changes. It does not get lighter, not yet. But the nature of the darkness shifts slightly, as if something has been added to it or subtracted from it, some quality that the middle of the night had, and that the hours approaching dawn do not. This is the hour we are in now, you and I, and the story's almost done, and the sea is still there in the dark outside everything doing what the sea does. The Pacific Ocean covers a third of the planet's surface. It is older than any name we have for it. The water in it has been cycling through the hydrological system for billions of years, evaporated, precipitated, collected in rivers, carried to the sea, evaporated again. The water that broke against the Valencia's hull on the night of January 4th 1906, is still water somewhere. It is not on the reef. It has moved as water moves through the system, and it is somewhere else now, in a cloud, in a river, in a glass of water on someone's bedside table in a city far from the coast. What the Pacific keeps, it keeps differently than we keep things. It does not keep them as we keep memories or as institutions keep records. It keeps them as matter, changed, transformed, incorporated into the biology and chemistry of the ocean, but present. The iron of the Valencia's hull is becoming part of the reef in a chemical sense as well as a physical one. The biological community that has established itself on the wreck is composed of organisms whose chemistry includes iron that was once in a ship. The materials of the disaster are still there, in the sea, reconfigured. This is a different kind of persistence than the persistence of stories, but it is not less real. The sea's keeping of things is literal and material, and entirely indifferent to whether anyone knows about it. The stories we tell about the Valencia are interpretations. They impose human meaning on events that had no inherent meaning, that were simply the physics and chemistry of ships and seas and cold water and January weather. The sea's version of the Valencia is not a narrative. It is a distribution of matter across the reef at Pachena Point. Between those two versions, the human narrative and the material distribution, is where the actual experience of the disaster lived, and where the survivors lived, and where the ghost lifeboat spent its 27 years in whatever cove it ended up in. Experience is not a narrative and it is not matter. It is what happens between the matter and the narrative, in the minds and bodies of the people who were there. The survivors carried their experience with them. They carried it in the way that all experience is carried, not as an object, not as a narrative, but as a quality of the interior that affects how things look and feel, and how the body responds to certain situations. People who have nearly drowned respond to water differently than people who have not. People who have clung to rigging in a January storm on the Pacific respond to certain kinds of weather differently. The experiences in them changing the texture of their subsequent experience. This kind of carrying is not usually called memory. Memory is the name we give to the capacity to recall events, to tell stories about them, to situate them in a narrative. What the Valencia survivors carried was something more like a modification, a change in the baseline of their experience of the world, in how they related to cold and dark and the sound of surf and the specific smell of salt air in winter. This modification was permanent and unchosen. It was the sea writing in them, the same way it writes in the reef. The coast of Vancouver Island carries the Valencia in a similar way. Not as a memory exactly. Places don't have memories in the way that people do, but as a part of its history that has shaped its present. The trail is there because the disaster happened. The lighthouse protocols are as they are because the disaster happened. The way people on this coast talk about fog and winter weather, and the specific quality of attention required when navigating the southwestern tip of the island, all of this has the Valencia in it, layered under the present like the old rock under the new soil. How long does a disaster persist in the culture of a place? There is no fixed answer. Some disasters persist for generations and then fade, leaving only a name on a street or a monument in a park and no living knowledge of what happened. Others persist much longer, embedded in the institutions and the stories and the physical geography of the place, in ways that are renewed with each generation of people who come to the place and learn its history. The Valencia is in the second category, at least for now. The questions that remain about the Valencia disaster are, in a sense, not different from the questions that remain about any significant historical event. What exactly happened? Why did it happen the way it did? What could have been done differently? These are the standard questions of historical inquiry, and in the Valencia's case they are answered, as well as they can be, in the investigation records and the survivor testimonies and the subsequent histories. The answers are not entirely satisfying, but they are as complete as they are likely to become. The question that the lifeboat adds is different. It is not a question about what happened. It is a question about what we cannot know, about the blanks in the record, about the things that occurred in the dark and the fog and the surf that no one observed and no one recorded, and that are therefore permanently outside the reach of historical reconstruction. The lifeboat is a reminder that the historical record is not the event. The event was larger than the record. It always is. This is a truth that applies beyond maritime disasters, Beyond this particular coast, every event is larger than the record of it. Every experience is larger than the account of it. Every disaster contains within it dimensions that are not captured in the investigation findings or the newspaper accounts or the survivor testimonies, not because anyone failed to capture them, but because they are beyond capture. They exist in the experience itself, which ended when the experience ended, which is in the nature of experience. The lifeboat came back dry and unexplained and sat in its cove for however many years it sat there and was found and examined and lost again to the record. It did not tell us what we most wanted to know. It told us only that it had been somewhere and that it was still intact, which is not nothing, but which is also not an answer. It is a form of the sea's typical response to questions: presence without explanation, arrival without account, the thing itself without the story of the thing. We are coming to the end now. The story has been what it is. A slow circling of a night in January 1906, and a lifeboat found in 1933, and the coast that connects them, and the questions that neither the coast nor the sea has chosen to answer. The circling was the point, not the answer, not the resolution, but the slow attention to a thing that deserves attention. The sea is still out there. The coast is still the coast. The rocks at Pachena Point are wet tonight, as they are most nights, as they will be for as long as there are rocks and a sea to break against them. And the Valencia is in the reef, the way history is in places, not visible, not obvious, but there, in the material of things, in the way the iron has become part of the stone, and the stone is part of the coast, and the coast is part of the sea that breaks against it in the dark. Let that image settle into stillness now. The ship on the reef, the coast in the dark, the fog moving across the water without hurry, without purpose, as it has always moved. The long patience of the Pacific, the small, bright fact of the people who came through, 37 of them carrying what they carried, going on into their altered lives. The sea does not need us to remember it, but it is good, perhaps, to remember anyway. To sit in the dark as you're sitting now, and think for a moment about the cold and the fog and the ones who held on through the night, and the ones who did not, and then to let the thought go gently, the way you release breath, the way water releases heat, the way the tide releases the shore. While the Valencia lay on her reef and the rescue ship stood off, and the shore parties worked their way down the life-saving trail, there were people in the small communities of Vancouver Island and the southern Washington coast who were waiting for news in the particular way that coastal people wait for news when something has gone wrong at sea. This waiting is not abstract. It is specific and physical. It inhabits the body, settles in the chest, makes the sounds of ordinary life seem oddly detached from the place where attention actually is. The community of Bamfield on the eastern shore of Berkeley Sound was one of the closest settlements to the Valencia wreck site accessible by water. It had a cable station, part of the Trans-Pacific Telegraph cable that ran from Bamfield to Fanning Island and thence to Australia and New Zealand. And this made it a communications hub in a part of the world where communications hubs were rare and precious. When word of the Valencia disaster reached Bamfield, it went out through that cable station to Victoria and Vancouver and Seattle, and eventually to the wider world. The people of Bamfield in 1906 were a small and varied community. There were the cable station workers and their families, who were there for institutional reasons. The government had posted them, and they lived and worked in conditions of unusual isolation even by the standards of the era. There were fishermen and their families, who had chosen the place for its position in relation to the fishing grounds of Berkeley Sound. There were a few traders and their families, sustaining the small commercial life of the settlement. In total, the population was not large, perhaps a few hundred people scattered across the settlement and its immediate vicinity. These people knew the sea. They knew it in the direct and practical way of people who live beside it and depend on it, not as a concept, not as an aesthetic experience, but as a physical reality that has to be dealt with every day, in all weathers and all seasons. They knew what bad weather looked like on Berkeley Sound. They knew the particular sound of the surf when a major swell was running. They knew, in their bones and in their judgment, what it meant for a ship to be in trouble on this coast in January. When word of the Valencia reached Bamfield, there was an immediate mobilization of what resources were available. Boats were prepared, men volunteered. The question of what could actually be done, given the distance to the wreck site, the sea conditions, and the limitations of the boats available, was one that had to be answered in real time, with incomplete information, by people who were doing their best with what they had. The Bamfield Life-Saving Station, which had been established partly in response to the increasing maritime traffic along this coast, had equipment and trained personnel. But the training of 1906 and the equipment of 1906 were limited by the technology of the era. A life-saving station in those years was a shore-based operation with certain specialised tools: the Lyle gun for firing lines, boats designed for surf work, trained crews accustomed to the specific demands of coastal rescue, but it was not equipped for the kind of rapid, large-scale response that the Valencia disaster required. The men who went to the wreck site from Bamfield did so in the knowledge that the conditions were very bad and that the probability of success was uncertain. This is a fact worth dwelling on for a moment, not to judge the choices that were made, but to understand the context in which they were made. Going into heavy surf in a small boat in January on this coast was not a small thing to ask of a man. The surf could capsize the boat. The cold could incapacitate the crew. The rocks could destroy the hull. The men who went anyway, in the full knowledge of these risks, because there were people alive on that ship who might be saved. The accounts of the shore-based rescue efforts are patchy. The men involved were not primarily recording their experiences but living them, and the official account collected later was necessarily incomplete. What emerges from the various sources is a picture of considerable effort, significant risk to the rescuers, and results that were far less than the situation demanded, not because the effort was inadequate, but because the situation was demanding more than the available resources could provide. Back in Victoria, and in Seattle and Vancouver, the newspapers were receiving reports by telegraph as fast as the reports could be transmitted, which was not particularly fast given the infrastructure of the era. The first reports were fragmentary. A ship in distress off Vancouver Island, details unknown. Later reports added detail. The Valencia, 164 aboard, on the rocks, in heavy weather. Later still, rescue ships on scene but unable to approach. Later still, survivors landing on the coast, numbers unknown. The families of passengers on the Valencia were in these cities, reading these reports. Some of them knew their loved ones were on the ship, others did not know yet. They had not expected the news to reach them, had not thought about the timing of the voyage in terms that included the possibility of disaster. The gradual revelation of what had happened, not all at once, but in increments, each telegram adding something and leaving something else uncertain, was its own particular kind of suffering. What do you do when someone you love is on a ship that has gone down, and you do not yet know the outcome? You wait. You read the newspaper, you go to the telegraph office, you ask the same questions of the same officials who have the same incomplete information they had an hour ago. You talk to other people in the same situation, which is the only comfort available and which is not very much comfort. You try to eat. You probably do not sleep. In Victoria, the Pacific Coast Steamship Company's offices became a gathering place for families seeking information. Officials of the company were there, fielding questions with the incomplete information they had, trying to be reassuring in the face of information that was not reassuring. The company's position was a difficult one, legally, commercially, and humanly difficult, from the moment the first reports arrived. They were the owners of the ship, the employers of the crew, the entity on whose behalf the voyage had been made. Whatever had happened was in some sense their responsibility, and they were aware of that. The newspapers were doing what newspapers did in 1906 when a major disaster occurred, covering it intensively with a mixture of factual reporting and the rhetorical amplification that disaster coverage has always involved. The headlines grew larger as the scope of the disaster became clearer. The stories acquired the particular texture of disaster journalism, the human interest angles, the heroism narratives, the accounts of the survivors, the photographs of the ship and the coast. What did the newspaper readers in Victoria and Vancouver and Seattle make of the Valencia disaster? They made of it what people always make of disasters that are nearby enough to be real, but far enough away to be read about in newspapers, a combination of horror, sympathy, the particular anxiety of people who live in a maritime city where such disasters are not abstract, and the survivor's instinct, the guilty involuntary relief of knowing that you are not the one on the ship. The aftermath of the disaster in these cities was similar to the aftermath in the coastal communities in some ways and different in others. In the cities, the disaster was one story among many, large and significant but not personal for most readers. In the coastal communities, it was personal for almost everyone, either through direct connection to the dead or the surviving, or through the shared understanding of what it meant to live beside a sea that did this. The water temperature in the Strait of Juan de Fuca and the adjacent coastal waters of Vancouver Island in January averages approximately 44 degrees Fahrenheit, roughly 6 degrees Celsius. This number is not a dramatic one standing alone. It does not sound lethal. 44 degrees is the temperature of a cool autumn day, the temperature of a glass of water that has been left to warm slightly from refrigerator temperature, the temperature of early morning in a temperate city in October. Nothing in that description suggests danger. What the number does not convey is what 44 degrees means to the human body when the human body is immersed in it. The body's relationship to cold water is governed by physics and biology that are indifferent to human intention. Cold water draws heat from the body far more efficiently than cold air at the same temperature, because water conducts heat much better than air. A person wearing warm clothing can survive indefinitely in 44-degree air. The same person in 44-degree water is in serious trouble within minutes. The precise timeline of cold water immersion depends on several factors: the person's size and body composition, whether they are wearing clothing, whether they are swimming or stationary, the exact water temperature. For a person of average size, unprotected in 44-degree water, the general timeline runs something like this. In the first 2 to 5 minutes, the cold shock response produces involuntary gasping and hyperventilation, which can cause drowning even in a person who would otherwise be capable of swimming. In the first 10 to 30 minutes, swimming failure occurs as the muscles of the limbs lose function due to cooling. After 30 to 90 minutes, hypothermia, the dangerous lowering of core body temperature, becomes incapacitating. Death follows from cardiac arrest or drowning. The people who went into the water from the Valencia, those who attempted to swim to shore, those who were washed off the ship by waves, those who were in lifeboats that swamped, faced this physiological reality with bodies that were already compromised. They had been cold for hours, exposed to spray and wind without adequate sleep or food. Their baseline was not the baseline of a healthy person entering cold water fresh. Their margin was narrower. The 44 degrees is why the 50 to 75 yards between the Valencia and the shore was for most people not survivable. It is not a long distance. In warm water, in calm conditions, a person who cannot swim at all might manage it. In 44-degree water, in January surf with rocks at the far end, it was a distance that only the strongest swimmers under the best of the bad conditions available had any chance of covering. The survivors who made it to shore from the water were, almost without exception, either extremely lucky or extremely strong, or both. What does it feel like to be very cold? This is a question that the medical literature describes in clinical terms, and that the Valencia survivors described in more personal ones. The first sensation is intense, almost painful. The cold of the water is not like the cold of air. It is more immediate, more insistent, more total. Then, over a period of minutes, the sensation changes. The pain recedes and is replaced by a numbness that moves from the extremities inward. The hands and feet go first, then the arms and legs lose fine motor control, then gross motor control begins to be affected. The numbness is deceptive. People in severe cold exposure often report that as the numbness deepens, they begin to feel less alarmed, which is the opposite of the appropriate response to the situation. The feeling of alarm, of urgency, of needing to act, is a product of a brain that is operating at normal temperature. As the brain cools, the alarm response weakens. People have been known to make very poor decisions in this state, to stop swimming, to relax into the water, to feel a kind of peace that is the biological equivalent of giving up. The survivors who made it out of the water described this state variously. Some described fighting against the numbness, using the rational knowledge that they needed to keep moving to override the physical sensation that said stopping was acceptable. Others described moments in the water when they were not sure how close they had come to simply stopping. The ones who were found on the rocks by the shore party were often in a state of hypothermia so severe that they could not speak coherently or move on their own. The shore party's work in warming and reviving the survivors they found was not a simple or pleasant task. The body in severe hypothermia needs to be warmed carefully, too rapidly, and the physiological shock of rewarming can itself be dangerous. The tools available to the shore party in 1906 were rudimentary by modern standards. Body heat, dry clothing, whatever shelter could be improvised. The medical understanding of hypothermia was less complete then than it is now, which meant that some of the interventions the shore party made were less effective than they might have been, and some might have been counterproductive. The people who survived the water had to survive what came after the water, which was the cold and the exhaustion and the shock of the experience compounding on bodies that had already been pushed to the limit. Several survivors who reached the shore nonetheless died in the hours after, from hypothermia that was too far advanced to reverse, from injuries sustained in the surf, from the combination of physical and psychological trauma that can, in extreme cases, simply stop the body's functioning. Of those who made it to safety alive, the recovery was not rapid. The accounts describe days of exhaustion, of the body needing to simply shut down and repair. Some survivors were bedridden for weeks. Some had lasting physical effects from the cold exposure and the trauma. Some of the effects were not physical at all, or not only physical. The complex of symptoms that we would now recognize as trauma responses was present in the accounts, described without the vocabulary of modern psychology, but recognizable in the behaviors and the reported experiences. The cold is the central physical fact of the Valencia disaster. It is the fact that determined most of the outcomes. People who stayed dry and elevated survived or had a better chance. People who went into the water usually did not. The lifeboats that mattered were the ones that kept people out of the water. The distance between the ship and the shore mattered because of what the water between them did to bodies. All of the drama of the night, the rockets, the rigging, the rescue ships standing off, is organised around this central physical fact of what 44 degrees of seawater does to a human being. Understanding this does not make the disaster less tragic. If anything, it makes it more so by clarifying exactly what was lost and how it was lost. The people who died were not defeated by anything metaphysical or mysterious. They were defeated by thermodynamics, by the physics of heat transfer, by the biological limits of the human body. These are facts so fundamental that nothing could have changed them. Not braver rescuers, not better trained crew, not a different position for the ship on the reef. The cold was there, and the bodies were limited, and those two facts in combination produced the outcome. There is something about this that the mind wants to resist. We want disasters to have human causes, human failures of courage or judgment or preparation, because human causes are ones we can imagine fixing. Thermodynamics cannot be fixed. The limit of the human body in cold water cannot be extended beyond a certain point by any act of will or any improvement in training. The Valencia survivors who made it survived largely because of where they were on the ship, how they got off it, and whether fortune placed them in a lifeboat or in the water, which is to say largely because of chance. The cold is still there, in the Strait of Juan de Fuca, in the waters off Pachina Point. It is always there. The temperature varies by a few degrees from season to season, but it never becomes warm, because this is the Pacific Ocean, and the upwelling of cold water from depth is a permanent feature of the oceanography of this coast. Divers who go to the Valencia wreck site today wear dry suits for this reason. The cold that stopped the hearts of Valencia passengers in January 1906 would stop a modern unprotected swimmer in the same number of minutes. The ocean does not adjust to human history. The Carmona Point lighthouse log for the 4th and 5th of January 1906 is a document with the particular dry quality of official records that were written without any awareness that they would become historical evidence. The lightkeeper wrote what lightkeepers wrote: the time, the weather, the visibility, the wind direction, the sea state, and whatever events of note occurred during his watch. The events of January 4th and 5th were considerable, and his account of them is one of the primary documentary sources for the early hours of the disaster. Lighthouse keepers in 1906 were a particular kind of person, selected partly for competence and partly for the capacity to live in isolation. The Carmona Light Station was not accessible by road. It was served by tender, meaning that supplies and mail and occasional visitors came by ship, which meant coming when the weather allowed and not coming when it did not. A lightkeeper and his family, posted to Carmona, were cut off from the normal social world for extended periods. This produced a certain character of person, self-sufficient, observant, accustomed to the company of a small household and the large impersonal company of the sea. The keeper at Carmona in January 1906 was Thomas Patterson. He had been at the Light for several years by then, which meant he knew the local character of the weather and the sound of the sea in ways that a newcomer would not. He knew what distress rockets looked like from the light station. He had seen them before, in the wrecks that had occurred on this coast before the Valencia, and he knew what they meant and what he was supposed to do when he saw them. Patterson's log entry for the early hours of January 5th records seeing rockets. The exact time is noted, as is the direction. He reported the sighting through the telegraph to Victoria, which was the established procedure. This report was the first official notification that a ship was in distress off Carmanah, and it set in motion the sequence of events that eventually brought the rescue ships and the shore parties to the scene. The time between Patterson's report and the arrival of meaningful help at the scene is one of the most painful numbers in the Valencia story. The distance from Carmanah to the wreck site, the distance from Victoria to the scene, the distance from the Bamfield station to the wreck, all of these distances, converted into time using the transportation technology of 1906, produced a gap between the first distress signal and the first rescue attempt that was measured in hours. Hours during which the people in the rigging were holding on, during which the ship was continuing to break up, during which the cold was doing what cold does. The lightkeeper's role in maritime disasters was not rescue. His job was to maintain the light and to report, and he did both. But the reports he made and the way they moved through the communication system of the era illuminate the limitations of that system in a very specific way. The telegraph was the fastest communication technology available, and it was fast enough in absolute terms. A message from Carmanah to Victoria in 1906 could arrive in minutes. What took time was not the transmission of the message, but the conversion of the message into action, the mobilization of ships, the deployment of shore parties, the coordination among multiple organizations with different jurisdictions and different resources. Patterson's log also records something else: his own attempts to fire the Lyle gun from the lighthouse station toward the wreck. The angle was not ideal, and the distance was at the edge of the gun's effective range, and the weather conditions were not favourable for accurate line throwing. His log notes the attempts and their results with the same brevity that characterised all lightkeeper records, the events described with the same economy of language, whether they were successful or not. There is something in this economy of language that is worth attending to. The lightkeeper's log was a record, not a narrative. It recorded events without editorialising about them, without expressing the feelings of the person recording them, without interpreting or explaining beyond the minimum necessary to make the record meaningful. This was the professional norm of the era for official records, and Patterson adhered to it. The result is a document that is useful to historians, and that is also, in its very restraint, somehow more affecting than a more emotional account would be. We do not know from the log what Patterson felt during the hours of January 5th. We do not know what it was like to be at the light station, knowing that a ship was on the rocks a few miles away, having made the report and fired the gun, and done what was possible to do from that position, and then waiting while the rescue process moved at its own speed. We do not know whether he watched through the light's equipment, whether he could see anything, whether the fog prevented observation, or whether he witnessed any portion of what was happening on the reef. What we do know is that the lightkeeper was part of the web of people who responded to the Valencia disaster from their various positions along the coast, each doing what their position made possible, none of them doing enough. Not because they failed, but because the disaster was larger than what any single position could address. The lightkeeper reported and fired his gun. The shore party came down the trail. The rescue ship stood off in the surf. Each of these responses was real and genuine, and part of the total human effort to do something about what was happening on the reef. The lightkeeping tradition along the coast of British Columbia lasted for most of the 20th century, with many of the stations established in the years around the Valencia disaster still manned by keepers well into the era of electronic navigation. The last manned Canadian lighthouses on this coast were automated only relatively recently, ending a tradition of human presence at these coastal outposts that had been continuous for more than a century. The keepers who came after Patterson at Carmanah, and there were many, the station operated for many decades, inherited both the physical infrastructure of the light and the historical weight of what had happened on their watch or near it. The Valencia was part of the institutional memory of Carmanah Point, part of what new keepers learned when they arrived and what they were aware of as they went about their work. The log that Patterson kept on January 4th and 5th, 1906, was part of the station's records, accessible to anyone who worked there. What does it mean to work in a place where something like this happened? The lighthouse keepers who came after the Valencia disaster went about their duties in full knowledge of what had occurred a few miles down the coast. They maintained the light that had been there and had not prevented the disaster. They kept their logs in the same format that Patterson had used. They responded to the occasional distress call that the coast continued to generate. And they lived with the landscape, with the sound of the surf at Pachena Point on winter nights, with the fog that came and settled on the water, with the particular quality of attention that you develop when you know what this coast is capable of. The logs of the lighthouse are in the archives now. They are available to researchers, and researchers have consulted them, and the information in them has contributed to the historical record of the Valencia disaster and of the coast more generally. They are dry and precise and factual, and in their dryness and precision and factuality, they carry something of the character of the people who kept them and of the life they led at the edge of that particular stretch of ocean. Thomas Patterson went on. He continued as a lightkeeper. He gave testimony to the investigation. His log entries were entered into the official record. He continued to maintain the Carmina light, which continued to warn ships away from this stretch of coast, which continued to work as lights are supposed to work. Not preventing all disasters, because lights cannot prevent all disasters, but reducing their frequency, which is what can be asked of a light. There were children on the Valencia. The manifest records them. The survivor accounts mention them. The casualty lists include them. They were there the way children are always there when families travel. Present, dependent, not fully understanding of the situation in the way that adults understand it, and for that reason both more vulnerable and in some ways less burdened than the adults around them. The youngest children on the Valencia were very young, infants, children of an age where they would have had no comprehension of what was happening, where their experience of the night of January 4th and 5th would have been limited to the sensation of cold, the unfamiliarity of circumstances, the absence of the routines and the familiar sounds and smells that constituted their entire world. Their parents, the ones who were with them, the mothers who carried them, were managing two things simultaneously: their own fear and the necessity of managing that fear in the presence of a creature who depended on them entirely. What do you do with an infant on a sinking ship? The question is both practical and unbearable. You hold the child. You wrap the child in whatever clothing you can find. You try to get to a place that is dry and elevated. You try to communicate with the crew about the lifeboats. You hold the child, and you hold the child, and you do not put the child down. Some of the children were older, old enough to understand that something serious was happening, old enough to be frightened in an adult way, old enough to understand the word wreck, and to know that it was bad. These children were also with parents, or with adults who had taken charge of them when their parents were separated from them in the confusion of the disaster. They clung to whoever was available. They did what children do when they are frightened and following the lead of adults. They watched the adults carefully to see how frightened to be. The accounts of the disaster that mention children are among the most difficult to read, not because they are graphically terrible, but because of the specific quality of the vulnerability they describe. Children in maritime disasters are, in the starkest sense, at the mercy of everything. The sea, the adults around them, the weather, the availability of lifeboats, the thickness of the clothing they happen to be wearing when the ship struck. They have no agency in the matter. They are cargo, in the most frightening sense, dependent on the system that was supposed to keep them safe, which has now failed, and on the improvised care of whoever is near them. The casualty list includes names followed by ages followed by the word child in some cases, or by the implied information of very young ages. Each of those names was a person whose life had barely begun, who had seen almost nothing of the world, who had no history worth speaking of, whose future was the entire content of their value. The loss of children in disasters is felt differently than the loss of adults, not because children are worth more in some abstract sense, but because the particular mathematics of what is lost is different. An adult who dies has lived a life. A child who dies has not yet had the chance. One account that has become part of the Valencia story's emotional core describes a woman, her name appears in some sources but the details vary, who survived by virtue of being swept overboard early and by some combination of chance and physical strength managing to reach the rocks, where she was found by the shore party. She had gone into the water holding her child. She arrived on the rocks alone. The accounts do not dwell on this. They note it and move on, in the way of official accounts that cannot afford to dwell. The loss of children in disasters is not categorically different from the loss of adults. The sea does not make these distinctions, but the human response to it is different, and the difference is worth attending to. When we read about the children on the Valencia, something in the response to the story changes. The disaster becomes more concrete, more immediate, more difficult to hold at the analytical distance that historical narrative usually maintains. The children do not allow that distance. They are also, in the accounts, sometimes the reason for extraordinary actions. Adults who might have given up, who might have let the cold or the exhaustion decide for them, did not give up because they were holding a child. The necessity of the child created a necessity in the adult that the adult's own necessity might not have. This is not a comfortable observation, but it appears in the accounts, and it tells us something about the way human beings function under extremity, that the responsibility for another can, in certain circumstances, extend the envelope of what is possible. What became of the children who survived? Some of them were very young, and the trauma of their early experience would not have been available to them as memory, in the way that adult trauma is available. The event would have been in them in other ways, in the body, in the patterns of response to certain situations, in the quality of their relationship to water and cold and the sound of surf. Not as a story they could tell, but as a texture of experience that shaped subsequent experience in ways that neither they nor anyone around them would necessarily have recognized as connected to the Valencia. Some of the older children who survived grew up to become, in some cases, the last living witnesses to the disaster. They were interviewed decades later when they were old, and the accounts they gave have a particular quality. They describe events seen through a child's eyes, which is to say events that are vivid in certain sensory details and hazy in certain contextual ones. Events that have the emotional truth of direct experience, even when the narrative logic of them is sometimes unclear. There is a gravity to these late accounts that comes from the simple fact of age, from the knowledge that the person speaking survived something when they were small, that they have carried the experience for 60 or 70 or more years, that the child who was on the Valencia and the old person being interviewed are the same continuous being, and that the distance between them is the entire arc of a human life. The child on the ship and the old person in the chair, the same person, with all of that between them. The children on the Valencia who did not survive have no such arc. Their lives end at the reef, at the age they were, in the cold water of January 1906. What they might have become is unknowable and is, in the mathematics of what was lost, part of what was lost. Every child has a future that is lost when the child is lost. This is the specific character of the grief for children that makes it different from the grief for adults. The manifest lists them, the casualty count includes them, the investigation mentioned them, and in the accounts of the survivors, the adults who were there, who held them or tried to hold them, who watched what happened, they are present in the way that is most essential, as people who were there, who were real, whose presence in the accounts is the only form of permanence available to them now. We cannot know their names in all cases, we cannot know their faces, we cannot know what they would have made of the life that was taken from them. We can know that they were there, on the ship, on the night of January 4th and 5th, and that the sea did not distinguish between them and the adults, and that the cold did not distinguish between them and the adults, and that none of that is fair, and that fairness is not a category that the sea operates in. Dead reckoning is a beautiful phrase for an imprecise art. The name itself is thought to derive from deduced reckoning, the estimation of a ship's position based on a known starting point, a known heading, a known speed, and the elapsed time. You know where you were. You know how fast you have been going, roughly. You know what direction you have been heading, roughly. You calculate where you must therefore be. The result is a position that is correct, in theory, in proportion to how accurate each of those inputs is. The problem is that none of the inputs in the era of the Valencia was entirely accurate. Speed was measured by a taffrail log, a device towed behind the ship that counted revolutions as the water moved through it, and thereby gave a figure for how fast the ship had been moving. This figure was a reasonable approximation, but it was affected by the state of the sea, by fouling of the hull, by the condition of the log itself. It was good to within perhaps 10 or 15% in normal conditions, and less accurate in heavy weather when the log could be affected by wave action. Heading was determined by compass, and compass was reasonably reliable in the abstract. Magnetic compasses work, but it was affected by the local magnetic anomalies of the coast, by the iron of the ship itself, by the deviation that was corrected for on charts but never perfectly. A compass error of 1 or 2 degrees, undetected, produces a position error that grows with every mile travelled. Over the distance from San Francisco to Vancouver Island, an uncorrected compass error of 2 degrees would produce a lateral displacement of many miles. And time was simply clock time, which in 1906 was available and relatively accurate on ships. Chronometers had been reliable for more than a century by then, but which was only one component of a calculation that also depended on the other 2 inputs being correct. The navigator's problem in 1906 was not that he lacked the will to know where he was. It was that the tools available to him had inherent uncertainties that accumulated over the course of a passage. A short passage in familiar waters with good visibility was manageable. You could see where you were, you could fix your position visually. You could correct the accumulated errors of dead reckoning against the reality of what you could observe. A long passage in poor visibility, with no opportunity for visual fixing, was a different matter entirely. Captain Johnson's last visual fix before the disaster is not precisely established in the accounts. The weather had been deteriorating since shortly after departure, and the coast of California was obscured by fog from early in the passage. The opportunity for celestial navigation, using the sun or stars to fix position, requires clear sky, which was not available. The opportunity for coastal pilotage, using visible landmarks to fix position, requires visibility, which was not available. Johnson was navigating by dead reckoning through the entire passage, without correction, for a day and a half before the ship struck. The error that accumulated over that 1.5 days was not a single large error, but the sum of many small ones, each individually within the margin of what might be expected from the instruments and the conditions. A small error in the compass reading. A small variation in the taffrail log from the actual speed. A small underestimate of the set and drift of the currents. Each of these, individually, was within the range of normal operational uncertainty. Together, they added up to a position error of perhaps 20 to 30 miles, enough to place the ship on the rocks when the navigator believed himself to be safely offshore. Navigation errors of this kind were not unusual in 1906. They were the inherent limitation of the technology. Ships ran aground regularly because of dead reckoning errors, in conditions that made visual fixing impossible. The established practice for managing this risk was caution, keeping a wider margin from the coast when in doubt, taking soundings to check the depth, and therefore the approach to the coast, slowing down in conditions of poor visibility and heavy weather. Some of these precautions were taken on the Valencia, some were not. The sounding question is the one that the investigators focused on most sharply. A sounding, measuring the depth of water beneath the ship, would have given Johnson information that might have allowed him to recognize that he was approaching the coast before he saw it. The bottom topography off the southwestern coast of Vancouver Island is distinctive and would have provided meaningful information to a navigator who was measuring depths regularly. But soundings in heavy weather are laborious and imprecise, and they were not taken on the Valencia during the approach to the coast. After the disaster, the question of whether soundings should have been taken became a central element of the investigation's findings. The answer, that they should have been, that the absence of soundings was a navigational precaution that should have been standard practice in those conditions, was clear enough in retrospect. Whether it was clear to Johnson in the moment, given the conditions and the state of his position estimate, is harder to say. He believed himself to be far enough offshore that soundings were not urgent. He was wrong. But wrongness of this kind is not always culpable negligence. It is sometimes simply the consequence of operating with inadequate information in conditions that prevent the acquisition of better information. The story of navigation is partly the story of the gradual development of technologies and practices that reduce the reliance on dead reckoning and the uncertainties it introduces. After the Valencia disaster, the discussion of coastal navigation practices along the Pacific coast intensified. The installation of additional whistling buoys and other audible markers, things that could be detected in fog, was proposed. The practice of taking soundings in poor visibility was reinforced in the regulations. The margin of safety required when navigating close to the coast was discussed in terms that were more precise than before. None of these improvements eliminated dead reckoning as a navigational technique, because they could not. GPS would not exist for another 80 years. Radio navigation aids would not be available for another 20. The tools available were the tools available, and the best that could be done was to use them more carefully and to design practices around their limitations. This was done incrementally after the Valencia, as it had been done incrementally after every major navigational disaster before her. The navigational charts in use in 1906 were not the charts of today. They were less detailed, less accurate, based on surveys that were older and rougher than what is now considered adequate. The surveys of the southwestern Vancouver Island coast that were available to Johnson had been conducted in the 19th century, in conditions that were sometimes less than ideal, with instruments that were less precise than modern survey instruments. The result was charts that were useful but that contained errors, some known and noted on the charts themselves, others unknown. One of the specific claims made in some accounts of the Valencia disaster is that the chart in use on the ship showed depths along the approach to the reef that were greater than the actual depths, that the chart understated the danger of the approach. This claim, if true, would mean that even a navigator who was taking soundings and checking them against the chart would not have been adequately warned by the discrepancy. The investigation looked at this question, and the findings were inconclusive. The chart evidence was not complete enough to establish definitively whether this was the case. What is established is that the navigation of this coast in 1906 was a difficult undertaking that required skill, experience, careful procedure, and a degree of luck, and that on the night of January 4th and 5th, the luck ran out. The skill was there, the experience was there, the careful procedure was there to the extent it was there. But the accumulation of small errors, the absence of certain safety-conscious practices, and the implacable character of the coast combined to produce an outcome that the skill and experience and procedure could not prevent. Dead reckoning, in the end, is an act of faith as much as an act of calculation. You believe in the accuracy of your instruments, and in the adequacy of your knowledge, and in the correctness of your procedures, and you proceed on that belief, and usually the belief is justified. When it is not, the sea is waiting. The telegraph network of the Pacific Northwest in 1906 was a fragile thing, essential, transformative, capable of moving information at speeds that would have been incomprehensible a generation earlier, but also vulnerable to the weather that it was meant to help people respond to. The overland telegraph lines that connected the coastal communities of Vancouver Island and the Washington coast to the larger network of cities and ports ran through terrain that was difficult in all seasons and extremely difficult in January. Trees fell on lines. Ice weighted the cables until they snapped. The storms that made the sea dangerous also made the communications infrastructure unreliable. In the hours after the Valencia went on the reef, the telegraph was working. The report from the Carmona lighthouse got through. The messages between Victoria and the rescue ships were transmitted. The information that there was a disaster in progress moved through the network with sufficient speed that rescue efforts began to be organised. But the network was also intermittently unavailable, and the specific details of the situation, how many people were alive on the ship, what their condition was, what the rescue ships were actually encountering when they reached the scene, were hard to convey with the rapidity and completeness that the situation demanded. The radio, the wireless telegraph as it was called in 1906, was a technology that was just beginning to become available on ships. Some ships were equipped with it, many were not. The Valencia was not. If she had been, the disaster would have had a different character, not necessarily a different outcome, because the fundamental physics of cold water and inaccessible shore would have been the same, but a different quality of communication with the outside world. The captain could have called for help from the moment the ship struck. The rescue ships could have been in direct communication with the Valencia throughout the night. The situation of the people in the rigging waiting for help they could not summon and could barely see would have been different in an important way. The absence of wireless telegraphy on the Valencia was not negligence. It was the state of the technology. Wireless telegraphy was being adopted by ships incrementally, beginning with the largest and most prestigious ocean liners. A working coastal steamer in 1906 was not the kind of ship on which new technology arrived quickly. The pace of adoption was commercial, driven by the cost of the equipment and the perceived need for it. The Valencia had not yet been equipped, and there was no particular reason to think she should have been before the disaster demonstrated why it mattered. After the disaster, the question of wireless telegraphy on coastal vessels received renewed attention. The Valencia case, in which the isolation of the ship in the hours after the grounding, the inability to communicate directly with rescue resources, had contributed to the difficulty of the rescue. was used as an argument for accelerating the adoption of wireless equipment on coastal passenger vessels. The argument was persuasive, and the regulation of wireless telegraphy on ships was tightened in the years following the disaster. But this is getting ahead of the story. In the immediate hours of the disaster, the communication network was what it was: telegraph lines that sometimes worked and sometimes did not, ship-to-shore communication that depended on being in visual range of a station with the right equipment, and the human networks of word of mouth and observation, and the sharing of information in the way of coastal communities that have always known that what happens at sea is everyone's business. The newspapers in Victoria and Vancouver received their first reports in the early morning hours of January 5th. The reports were fragmentary: a ship in distress, a steamer, off Vancouver Island, the identity not yet confirmed. By mid-morning the Valencia was identified, and the general picture, a passenger steamer on the rocks, rescue attempts underway, outcome uncertain, was available to newspaper readers in those cities. By afternoon, the first more detailed reports were coming through, and the picture was becoming worse. The afternoon newspapers, which existed in that era as a separate edition, meeting the demand for current news in a world before radio and television, carried the growing toll. The morning editions had been uncertain. The afternoon editions were more certain, and what they were certain about was bad. The number of those known to be saved was small. The number on the ship was large. The conditions continued to be severe. The rescue efforts continued to be stymied by the surf. For the people in Victoria and Vancouver who were waiting to hear about family members on the Valencia, the afternoon editions were the moment of dawning certainty that they had been hoping not to arrive at. Not certainty that any specific person was lost. That information was still not available, because the rescue was still in progress and the accounting of who had survived was still incomplete, but certainty that the situation was far worse than the early reports had suggested, and that the probability of survival for those not yet known to be saved was diminishing. The telegrams that went to families were the other mode of individual communication. The Pacific Coast Steamship Company and the Maritime authorities were in the business of sending telegrams in those hours, to families who had inquired, to the agencies that would need to know, to the ports at which the Valencia had been expected to arrive, and which were now expecting her in a different sense than they had been. Telegrams of the kind that begin, "We regret to inform you," are among the most dreaded communications in human experience, and the telegraph offices of Victoria and Vancouver were producing them in those hours. The wire going silent is a metaphor as well as a fact. For the people on the Valencia, cut off from the world by the distance and the conditions and the absence of wireless equipment, there was a specific quality to the isolation that the technological situation created. They had sent distress rockets. They had sounded the whistle. They had made the signals that the established system recognized as meaning help is needed here. And from the outside, as far as they could tell in the dark and the fog, nothing was coming. The wire, the connection to the world that might help them, was silent on their end. This is one of the oldest fears of the sea, not the specific fear of drowning, but the fear of being where help cannot reach you, of being in a situation that the systems that exist for helping people are somehow not reaching. The lifeboats that did not come back, the rescue ships that stood off in the surf, the shore that was visible but unreachable. All of these were versions of the wire going silent, of the communication channel that exists but is not functioning in the direction you need it to function. There is a particular psychological phenomenon that disaster researchers have documented in the survivors of maritime catastrophes. The period after the immediate crisis, when the person is physically safe, often produces a kind of delayed collapse of the emergency functioning that has sustained them through the crisis. The body and mind have been operating at a level of sustained alertness and effort that cannot be maintained once the immediate necessity is removed. What follows the crisis is often a period of extreme exhaustion and emotional flooding, the feelings that were suppressed during the crisis arriving all at once. The survivors of the Valencia who were brought ashore in the hours and days after the disaster experienced this in various ways. The accounts describe people collapsing, people weeping without being able to stop, people unable to speak, people sleeping for many hours and waking still exhausted. The wire, for them, had been silent during the crisis. They had functioned by directing all their resources toward surviving. When the survival was accomplished and the wire came back on, It came back carrying everything that had not been felt during the hours when survival required all the available capacity. The wire goes silent in many more ways than the literal one. It goes silent between people who cannot speak about what they have experienced. It goes silent in the public record where the official accounts run out. It goes silent in the long years between the disaster and the discovery of the lifeboat, when the Valencia was out of the news and out of most people's attention, but still present in the memories of the survivors and the families and the communities of the coast. The silence is not absence, it is a form of presence and what is there but not being said. There is a modern dimension to the Valencia story that its original participants could not have imagined. The wreck site is now regularly visited by divers who descend into the cold water at Pachina Point and move through the remnants of the ship with underwater lights and cameras, seeing what is left of the Valencia in a way that is completely different from any observation made in 1906. Diving on the Valencia wreck is not easy. The conditions that made the location of the disaster so severe are still present. The water is cold, divers must wear dry suits, the kind that seal the body completely from the water, and even with this protection the cold is a constant presence. The visibility is variable, sometimes reasonable, sometimes very poor, affected by the surge and the silt. The site is exposed to the same ocean swells that broke the ship, and on bad days it is not diveable at all. What the divers find when conditions permit is the transformed remnant of the Valencia. The wooden portions of the ship have long since been destroyed. Wood does not survive in this kind of marine environment for more than a few decades at most. What remains is iron, the hull plating, the machinery, the structural elements that were built to last. Iron in salt water corrodes at a rate that depends on many factors, and the Valencia's iron has been corroding for more than 100 years, but it has not disappeared. The hull plates, heavily encrusted with marine growth, are recognizable for what they are. The machinery in the engine room, the massive compound steam engines that drove the Valencia north toward her end, is still in place, silted and corroded, but present. The wreck sits in relatively shallow water, shallow enough that sport diving is possible without specialized deep water equipment, though the cold and the conditions make it demanding. The orientation of the wreck on the reef corresponds to the descriptions given by the survivors. This is where the bow was, this is where the stern sank deeper. This is the relationship to the reef and the shore that the accounts describe. The geography of the disaster, as told by the survivors and confirmed by the investigators, is legible in the physical layout of the remains. Divers have documented the site extensively in photographs and video. The images have been published and are available to anyone interested, a form of access to the wreck that would have seemed miraculous to the investigators of 1906. You can see what the divers see, the encrusted hull plates, the machinery, the way the wreck has become part of the reef, colonized by the biological community of the intertidal zone and the subtidal. Anemones and encrusting bryozoans and various other organisms have made their homes on the iron surfaces. The Valencia has been thoroughly naturalized. There is something moving about these images if you look at them with knowledge of what they are. The abstract mass of encrusted iron that a diver's light reveals is the material remnant of a specific event, not of the event itself, because events are not material, but of the ship that was part of the event. The incrustation is the sea's way of incorporating the ship into itself, of making what was built by human hands into part of the reef that broke it. It is a long, slow metabolization, not hostile, not celebratory, simply the biological and chemical process of the marine environment doing what it does to everything that enters it. Divers have reported seeing specific artifacts in the vicinity of the wreck, pieces of machinery, hardware, the occasional object that is identifiable as having been part of the ship's fittings or cargo. The accumulation of these observations has added to the historical record of the wreck in small ways, confirming details of the ship's layout that were described in the survivor accounts, adding material evidence to the documentary record. What divers have not found is any evidence related to the mystery of the lifeboat. This is not surprising. The lifeboat was found 27 years after the disaster, in a cove in the Broken Group Islands, not at the wreck site. Whatever happened to the lifeboat between January 1906 and whenever it entered its cove was not at Pachina Point, and the wreck site cannot tell us about it. The wreck can tell us about the ship. The lifeboat question requires information that the wreck does not have. The experience of diving on a ship where people died is described differently by different divers, and the differences are interesting. Some divers report feeling a strong sense of historical presence, of being in a place where something significant happened, of the wreck as a memorial as well as a physical site. Others report simply the experience of diving, focused on the technical demands of the conditions and the pleasure of seeing something unusual and interesting. These different responses are not in contradiction. The wreck is both things, a historical memorial and a diving site. The same physical reality as both, depending on how you approach it. The marine environment around the wreck has been significantly altered by the presence of the iron. Iron is a nutrient for marine life, and the gradual corrosion of the Valencia's hull has been releasing iron into the local water column for over a century. The biological community around the wreck is denser and more diverse than the surrounding reef, partly because of the hard substrate that the iron provides, and partly because of the nutrient enrichment. The ship that was lost has become over time a reef that supports life. This transformation is one of the less remarked upon aspects of maritime wrecks, but one of the more consistent ones. Ships that go down in shallow water become artificial reefs, colonized by the organisms of the marine environment over decades, and eventually become more productive biologically than the surrounding seafloor. The Valencia has been doing this for more than 100 years. What was lost has become, in a material sense, something that sustains. The diving community has its own relationship to the Valencia story. The wreck is known among Pacific Northwest divers as a significant historical site and a challenging dive. The combination of historical importance and diving challenge is attractive to a certain kind of diver, and the Valencia wreck has been visited by many people over the years, each of them experiencing the site in the particular sensory way of diving, which is nothing like looking at photographs and nothing like reading accounts. Underwater, sound is different, vision is limited and distorted. Movement is slow and requires effort. The cold is omnipresent. The organisms of the reef are everywhere visible in a way they are not visible from above. The sense of being in a different medium, genuinely inside the ocean rather than on top of it, is one of the more distinctive experiences available to a person who chooses to seek it out. And in this medium, the remnant of the Valencia sits in its encrusted silence, still there, still itself, transformed by more than a century in the sea into something that is no longer exactly a ship, but is still identifiably the ship. The sea keeps what it takes, in its own way. It does not keep things as they were. It keeps them as it has made them, changed, naturalized, incorporated. The Valencia on the reef is not the Valencia that ran aground in January 1906. But it is continuous with that ship. The iron is the same iron. The reef is the same reef. The relationship between the two is the relationship established on that night, extended over more than 100 years of corrosion and accumulation and biological colonization. When divers come up from the Valencia wreck into the cold Pacific light, they are coming back from somewhere that is genuinely different from the surface world. They have been inside the sea's keeping. They have seen what the sea has done with what it took, and what the sea has done is, in its own indifferent way, not nothing. We have been at sea for a long time now, you and I. We have been in the dark and the cold and the fog circling the reef at Pachina Point, returning again and again to the night of January 4th and 5th, 1906. The story has been what it is, large and cold and incomplete, the way sea stories always are, because the sea does not cooperate with the human desire for complete narratives and tidy endings. But there is another kind of story that the Valencia tells, a quieter one, which is the story of the ordinary people who were on her, not as historical figures, not as participants in a documented disaster, but as people. They had names and faces and the particular accumulation of ordinary experience that constitutes a life. They had preferences about food and opinions about the weather and relationships with other people that were complex and specific and real in the way that only actual relationships are real. They were not symbols of anything. They were people. The Portuguese family whose name appears in the survivor accounts. Their names are in the records, accessible to anyone who wants to look them up. A father, a mother, children. They were going somewhere. They had a reason for being on the Valencia, a practical reason involving the ordinary geography of their lives. They needed to get from San Francisco to Victoria, or to some stop along the way, and the Valencia was the ship available when they needed to travel. They booked their passage and gathered their belongings and got on the ship in the ordinary way that people get on ships when ships are the transport available. We do not know much about the internal life of this family in the hours of the disaster. We know some things about their external circumstances. We know they were on the ship. We know the disaster happened. We know something about who survived from the various accounts. But the interior, what they said to each other, what they thought about, what the experience of that night was like for specific people in a specific family with specific relationships to each other, is not in the record. The record gives us names. It does not give us people. This is one of the limitations of historical narrative that historians are always working against and never fully overcoming. The past is full of people who have been reduced to names and dates and the occasional anecdote, whose inner lives are as inaccessible as the interior of the ghost lifeboat in its cove. We can reconstruct the external circumstances with reasonable accuracy. We cannot reconstruct the experience of those circumstances from the inside. What we can do is sit with the knowledge of what we do not know, which is its own kind of relationship to the past. The people on the Valencia were real. The fact that we cannot know them in the way we know the people in our own lives does not make them less real. It simply locates them in a different relationship to us. Not as presences, but as traces. Not as people we can know, but as people who were, whose being was real even though it is no longer accessible. There is a practice in some traditions of commemoration that involves speaking the names of the dead. Not analysing them, not interpreting them, simply saying the names. This practice acknowledges that the name is the minimum unit of a person's identity, the thing that persists when everything else is gone, and that saying the name is a form of acknowledgement that the person existed and that their existence was significant regardless of what happened to them subsequently. The names on the Valencia casualty list can be said. They are there in the records and they can be said. The practice of saying them does not accomplish anything in the practical sense. It does not change what happened, does not alter the record, does not provide comfort to anyone who might need it after more than 100 years. But it is a form of acknowledgement. It is the minimum that can be done, which is also sometimes the most appropriate thing that can be done. As this story moves toward its quiet conclusion, let the names be present in whatever form is available to you. You do not need to say them aloud. You do not need to look them up. Simply knowing that the names exist, that the list is there, that behind each name is a person who was on a ship on a winter night in 1906, this is enough. The acknowledgement can be interior and quiet, the way this whole story has been interior and quiet, the way sleep-adjacent thought tends to be. The lifeboat found in 1933 had no names on it. It was just a boat, old, weathered, dry inside, belonging to a ship that had gone down 27 years before. But because the Valencia had names on her manifest and names on her casualty list, the lifeboat's appearance reopened the question of which of those names it might have carried and what those names might be connected to. The lifeboat's blankness was significant precisely because it came from a ship whose passenger list was known, even if imperfectly. All the things that have been said in this story about the Valencia, the navigational error, the cold, the rigging, the rescue attempts, the investigation, the lifeboat, the divers, the lightkeeper, the trail. All of these things are ways of approaching the actual subject, which is the people. The ship is interesting because of the people on her. The sea is significant because of what it does to people. The lifeboat mystery matters because of the people it might have carried. Everything in this story points back to the people, who are the centre of it, and the part we cannot fully know. You're perhaps very close to sleep now. The story has been moving towards stillness for some time, and stillness is where sleep is. And the approach to sleep is what this story has been about from the beginning. Not the disaster exactly, not the navigation or the cold or the investigation, but the approach to stillness. The telling of a story like this one is a way of accompanying someone towards sleep, of providing the gentle, sustained presence of a voice and a narrative that the mind can follow without urgency, that keeps the attention occupied without demanding active engagement. The sea is good for this. The sea is one of the great sleep sounds, the rhythmic quality of it, the consistency of it, the way it fills without demanding response. Stories about the sea carry that quality, even when the sea is not literally present. The rhythm of the telling is the rhythm of the water, which is the rhythm that the body knows before it knows anything else. Let the story settle now. The Valencia is on her reef. The lifeboat is in its cove, or wherever coves are in the geography of settled narratives. The lightkeeper has made his entry in the log. The investigators have closed their files. The trail through the forest is there, available to those who want to walk it, leading along the coast above the water, through the old growth and the ferns and the mud of January, to the viewpoint above Pachina Point, where you can look down at the water and know something about what happened there. The water is grey and cold, and the surf breaks on the rocks below with the same patient rhythm it has always had and will always have. And the story is done, and it is enough. And the stillness that follows the story is the stillness that was there before the story began. Grief, like water, finds the shape of whatever contains it. There is no universal form for it, no standard duration, no prescribed intensity. In 1906, the social architecture for grief was different from what it is now. There were rituals and expectations and costumes and time frames that were specific to the era. But beneath the social architecture was the same fundamental human experience, the absence of someone who was present, the specific weight of that absence, the way a person-shaped hole persists in the world when the person is gone. The widow of a Valencia passenger in 1906 would have worn black for a prescribed period. She would have received condolence calls from neighbours and friends, who would have sat with her and expressed sorrow in the language of the era, and she would have responded in that language because the social forms for grief are one of the ways that people manage the formless thing it actually is. The forms give it shape. The shape makes it bearable or at least navigable. What the forms did not address, what the social architecture of grief in any era does not fully address, was the specific content of the loss, the absence of a particular person, the particular voice, the particular habits, the particular weight of a specific person's presence in a specific life. This content is not transferable. The condolence call expresses sympathy for the condition of being bereaved, not for the specific loss of this person. The distinction matters enormously to the bereaved person, for whom the general condition is almost entirely constituted by the specific loss. Among the most difficult aspects of the Valencia disaster for the families of those who were lost was the uncertainty that persisted for some time about who had survived and who had not. The passenger manifest was not complete. The accounting of survivors was done gradually, as people were recovered and identified. In the first days after the disaster, families in Victoria and Vancouver and San Francisco did not know with certainty whether their specific person was alive or dead. This uncertainty is, in some ways, worse than certainty of loss. Certainty of loss, however terrible, allows the grief process to begin. Uncertainty keeps the person in a suspended state, not gone, not present, somewhere between. The cognitive and emotional labour of sustaining that suspension, of not knowing whether to grieve or to hope, is exhausting and destabilising in a way that grief alone is not. Some families knew immediately because their family member was among the survivors who were quickly identified and reported to the authorities. Others waited days for certainty. The body of the worst news, the official notification that a specific person was among the dead, came at different times to different families, depending on whether a body had been recovered and identified, or whether the accounting of survivors had been completed enough to establish that a specific person was not among them. Bodies were recovered from the sea and from the beaches in the days and weeks after the disaster. Not all of them could be identified immediately. Some were identified by personal effects, jewellery, clothing, documents. Others were identified by physical description, matched against the accounts of people who had known the person. Others were never identified and were buried as unknown, which added to the grief of the families who were left not knowing whether the person they had lost was among the identified dead or the unaccounted for. The sea gives back bodies on its own schedule, which has no relationship to the needs of the living. Bodies in cold water are well preserved for longer than bodies in warm water, which means that the sea might return someone weeks after a disaster in a condition that still permits identification, but the sea also keeps bodies, takes them to depths or locations where they are not recoverable, or distributes them along currents in ways that take them far from where they were lost. The Valencia produced both of these outcomes. Some bodies were recovered, some were not, and the accounting was never complete. For the families who received no body, grief had a particular quality of incompleteness. The ritual of burial, of placing the body in the ground or the water, of having a specific place that marked the presence of the person's remains, of doing the physical thing that human cultures have always done with their dead, was not available. They were left with the fact of loss without the ceremony that helps convert the fact into something the psyche can accept and work with. This is a form of disenfranchised grief for a loss that cannot be fully mourned in the normal way because the normal rituals are unavailable. It is common in maritime disasters and in other forms of catastrophic loss where bodies are not recovered. The psychological research on this kind of grief suggests that it can be more persistent and more difficult to process than grief that is accompanied by the full ritual of mourning, because the rituals perform actual psychological work and their absence leaves that work undone. The community of grief that formed around the Valencia disaster was not only the families of the dead, it included the survivors who were carrying their own complicated relationship to the event, the guilt, the relief, the trauma, the recurrent memories. It included the rescuers who had tried and not been able to do enough, the shore parties, the lifeboat crews, the captains of the Queen and the city of Topeka who had stood off in the surf and watched. It included the people in the coastal communities who had no direct connection to the dead, but who were members of a community of people who live beside the sea and know that what happened to the Valencia could happen to anyone they knew. This broader community of grief is harder to document than the specific grief of individual families. It does not leave records in the same way, but it is part of the aftermath of maritime disasters in a way that matters. It shapes the culture of the community, the way people think about the sea and about safety, and about the responsibility that members of a coastal community have to one another when the sea does what it does. The grief of this broader community also has a public dimension. The newspaper coverage of the Valencia disaster was one expression of public grief, not quite the same thing as private grief, but related to it. The public attention to the disaster, the intensity of the coverage, the political pressure that generated investigations and regulatory changes, all of these were expressions of a collective response to collective loss that was different from private grief, but was nonetheless a form of grief. What does a community do with its public grief? In 1906, the available forms were the newspaper, the public memorial, the official inquiry, the regulatory change. These forms addressed the grief in the way of official responses. They acknowledged that something terrible had happened. They assigned responsibility in whatever measure was possible. They implemented changes intended to prevent recurrence. None of this was the same as grieving, but it was the institutional analogue of grieving, the public process of working through what had happened. More than a century later, the architecture of grief for the Valencia disaster has been transformed by time into the architecture of history. The grief is no longer fresh. The people who grieved are gone. What remains is the record, the investigation documents, the newspaper accounts, the survivor testimonies, the maritime histories, and the places that carry the history in their physical form, the trail, the lighthouse, the reef, the monument. These are the lasting architecture of what was felt, transformed by time into something that can be visited and read and walked through by people who are not there and who are therefore not grieving, but are perhaps doing something adjacent to it. Something that involves allowing the weight of what happened to be present briefly before setting it down again. There is a specific sound that the Pacific makes in winter on the coast of Vancouver Island that you can hear on recording, though a recording does not fully convey it. It is a deep, persistent, layered sound, not the sharp, percussive sound of waves breaking on a beach, but the heavy, complex sound of ocean swell meeting rock coast, which involves frequencies from very low to fairly high, sustained over time, varying in intensity but never ceasing. It is the sound of an enormous amount of water moving continuously against an immovable surface. People who live on this coast hear this sound all the time, in the way that people who live near rivers hear the river, or people who live near train lines hear the trains, with a degree of conscious attention that is much less than the sound actually merits, because the brain adapts to constant stimuli by reducing the conscious attention paid to them. The sound becomes background. It becomes the texture of the place rather than an event in the place. You stop hearing it in the way that you hear a conversation and start hearing it in the way that you hear your own heartbeat. Present, continuous, there when you listen for it but not demanding attention when you are occupied with something else. The survivors of the Valencia heard this sound with none of that habituated intention. They heard it the way you hear a sound that has just become relevant to your survival, with the full, immediate attention of a nervous system that has just connected this particular stimulus to this particular danger. The sound that was background for the lightkeeper and the residents of Bamfield was, for the people in the rigging of the Valencia, the sound of what was going to kill them if they let go. There are sounds that the brain does not forget in the way it forgets ordinary sounds. Sounds associated with extreme stress or danger are encoded differently, more deeply, more precisely, more durably. The smell of smoke, the sound of a specific alarm, the quality of silence that follows an explosion. These are the kinds of sensory memories that persist for decades, that surface involuntarily in situations that bear some resemblance to the original experience, that do not fade in the ordinary way. The survivors of the Valencia carried the sound of that surf with them. This is not speculation. It is in the accounts. Several survivors, in interviews given years and decades after the disaster, describe being triggered by the sound of a heavy surf, by the specific quality of the Pacific in winter weather. The sound brings back the experience in a way that does not feel like remembering. It feels like being there again, which is the characteristic of traumatic memory that distinguishes it from ordinary memory. The Pacific in winter is a sound machine. It generates sound in multiple frequencies, in multiple locations along the coast continuously. The deep bass of the primary swell, the higher frequencies of the breaking surf, the sound of spray against rock, the particular note of the wind in certain kinds of terrain. These sounds layer and interact in ways that are complex enough to be interesting acoustically, but simple enough to be, over time, soporific, which is why recordings of ocean surf are used as sleep aids and have been used that way for as long as recordings of ocean surf have existed. The relationship between the sound of the sea and sleep is an old one. The rhythm of surf is similar to the rhythm of breath, which is similar to the rhythm of a heartbeat, which is the sound that every person heard before they heard anything else. The heartbeat of the body that carried them in the months before birth, when the world was warm and dark and rhythmic. The sea, at a certain distance and in certain conditions, reproduces something of that quality. The brain recognizes it, or something like it, and responds to it with the beginning of the descent towards sleep. The fact that the same sound that relaxes a person at a safe distance can terrify a person in danger is one of the more interesting demonstrations of how context determines experience. The Pacific surf that is the background to a pleasant evening on a coastal resort porch is, in its physical character, identical to the Pacific surf that was the background to the Valencia disaster. The water molecules are the same, the acoustic physics are the same, the experience is completely different, because experience is not constituted by physical stimuli alone, but by physical stimuli processed through a nervous system that has an assessment of what the stimuli mean for the survival of the organism. Tonight, the Pacific surf is a long way from you. Whatever water is near you is not the water off Pachena Point in January. The cold that was the central fact of the Valencia disaster is not your cold. The dark that made the shore invisible from the rigging is not your dark. These things are true, and they matter. Not because they need to be said, but because the body benefits from the reminder. You are warm, the surf is far away. The night outside is the ordinary night of your ordinary life, which is a profound and underrated thing to be. The sound of water in a more intimate context, not the open Pacific, but the sound of rain on a window, the sound of a stream, the sound of water moving through pipes in a building at night, is one of the most effective sleep sounds. It shares with ocean surf the qualities of rhythm and continuity, and the gentle filling of acoustic space, but it is scaled to the domestic, to the interior, to the small and warm world of a building at night. It has none of the scale or power of the open sea. It is water as companion rather than water as force, water as the small steady presence that keeps a space from being entirely silent. The Pacific makes its sounds regardless of who is listening and what those listeners are experiencing. It has been making these sounds for millions of years through climatic conditions that have varied enormously, in the presence and absence of every species that has ever lived on its shores. The sounds it made on January 4th and 5th, 1906, were the same sounds it had been making for millions of years before that night, and that it has been making in the years since. The disaster was an event in the lives of the people involved in it. For the Pacific, it was not an event at all. This disproportion between the enormity of the experience for the people involved and the complete absence of any impact on the ocean that produced the experience is one of the things that makes the sea philosophically interesting as a subject. It does not care. Not in the way that a hostile thing does not care, not with the specific quality of indifference that is also an absence of care. but in a deeper sense. Care is a quality of consciousness, and the Pacific Ocean does not have consciousness, and therefore cannot care. The experience of its indifference as indifference is something that the human consciousness brings to the encounter. The ocean simply is. There is something restful in this, if you allow it to be restful. The sea's indifference to human affairs means that it is not judging, it is not recording, it is not forming opinions about what happened on January 4th and 5th, 1906. It is simply there, doing what it does in the way it has always done it. The weight of human meaning, the disaster, the grief, the investigation, the ghost lifeboat, the questions that have no answers, all of this is something that people carry. The sea does not carry it. The sea is carrying nothing but water. You can borrow something of that quality for a little while, not the indifference. That would require being something other than a person, and you are a person, and that is not something to give up. But the not carrying, the temporary suspension of meaning in favour of the simple sensory fact of being warm and still and breathing, this is available. It is available right now, in fact, in the darkness that surrounds the story and in the particular quality of rest that the story has been building toward. The Pacific makes its sounds, the coast receives them, the reef at Pachena Point is wet with spray. The fog tonight is wherever fog goes, perhaps there, perhaps somewhere else, perhaps settled on the water in the way of something that is too heavy to be anywhere else. The story is ending, the sound of the surf is very far away, and the quiet, which has been there all along beneath the story, is coming back now, gently, like the tide. The route that the SS Valencia was travelling, from San Francisco north along the Pacific coast to Victoria, is one of the oldest and most consistently travelled maritime routes in North American history. Ships have been making this run since the fur trade era, since the gold rushes, since the establishment of the steamship lines that followed. The route is not complicated in concept. Follow the coast north, navigate around the cape at the southwestern tip of Vancouver Island, enter the Strait of Juan de Fuca, and proceed to Victoria. In practice, the complications are considerable. The inside passage, the sheltered route between Vancouver Island and the mainland of British Columbia, was not the route the Valencia was on. She was on the outside route, the coastal route, which is exposed to the full force of the Pacific. The inside passage, when it is used, offers shelter from the ocean swells behind the mass of Vancouver Island, and the weather on the sheltered side of the island is generally significantly milder than on the ocean side. Many vessels that travelled this coast preferred the inside passage when they could use it. The Valencia, for reasons that were standard practice for the coastal service, was on the outside. The difference between the inside and outside routes on this coast is the difference between two different versions of the Pacific Northwest, the exposed version and the sheltered version. The exposed coast, the west coast of Vancouver Island, is where the full force of the open Pacific arrives after crossing thousands of miles of unobstructed ocean. It is one of the most wave-exposed coastlines in North America. The sheltered coast, the east coast of Vancouver Island facing the Strait of Georgia, is calm enough for recreational paddling on most summer days. January on the exposed coast is January in its most complete expression. The storms that have built across the Pacific since October have, by January, accumulated their full energy and are delivering it to the coast in the form of swells that are measured in meters of height and seconds of period, numbers that, for people who spend their lives at sea, have immediate and practical meaning, and that for everyone else are best understood through the fact that a 10-metre swell in open ocean is a hill of water moving steadily across the surface at highway speeds. The mariners who work the Pacific coastal route knew January. They had all been through it, in various ships and various conditions, and they had developed a relationship to it that was neither fearful nor careless, but professional. The relationship of experienced people to a difficult recurring challenge. January on the coast was difficult. January was always difficult. You prepared for it. You ran the route when you had to, and with appropriate caution. You did not underestimate it. Whether Captain Johnson underestimated January 1906 is a question that cannot be answered with certainty now. The investigators of the time formed a view that certain precautions were not taken that should have been taken, that the margin of safety being maintained was smaller than the conditions warranted. This view has a certain retrospective quality to it that is hard to escape. It is easy to say, after the event, that the precautions should have been greater. It is harder to specify, beforehand, exactly what additional precautions would have been appropriate for these conditions, because the conditions appeared, to the people experiencing them, to be within the range of what was manageable. This is the fundamental problem of accident investigation, and it applies to the Valencia as it applies to every accident. The precautions that would have prevented the accident are obvious only in retrospect. Before the accident, the conditions look like conditions. After the accident, they look like warnings. The difference is not in the conditions, but in the knowledge of what happened. The navigator who did not take soundings was not negligent in the sense of knowing that soundings were needed and not taking them. He was negligent in the sense of not maintaining a level of precautionary behaviour that, given the inherent uncertainty of the situation, should have been standard. The January Pacific does not forgive the difference between these two kinds of negligence. It does not care whether the failure was one of knowledge or one of judgment. The result of both is the same: a ship on the rocks, cold water, and the consequence that follows from cold water and rocks. In the decades after the Valencia disaster, the coastal route north became progressively better served by navigational aids. Lights were added, radio beacons were installed, the charts were revised and updated, the life-saving infrastructure along the coast was improved, and the shipping technology itself changed. Ships became larger, better equipped, more resilient to weather, equipped with radio communications that allowed them to check their positions by means that did not exist in 1906. The route that was dangerous in 1906 is not equally dangerous today. The technological transformation of navigation over the 20th century has made the kind of navigational error that sent the Valencia onto the reef at Pachena Point much less likely. A modern vessel on this route has GPS, has radar, has radio communication, has weather forecasting of a precision that would have seemed miraculous in 1906. The margin for error has been widened enormously by technology. But the coast itself, the physical character of the western shore of Vancouver Island, has not changed. The rocks at Pachena Point are the same rocks. The currents run the same way. The weather comes from the same directions. If you stripped away all the modern navigational technology and put a modern ship on this route with 1,906 instruments and 1,906 information, you would be back to the fundamental challenge that defeated the Valencia: navigating in poor visibility, close to a dangerous coast, with instruments that have inherent uncertainties and no way to correct for those uncertainties without visual reference to the coast. The technology has changed, the coast has not, and this is worth knowing because it places the Valencia in its proper historical context, not as an aberration, not as the result of uniquely bad navigation or uniquely bad conditions, but as an example of what happens when the limitations of a navigational technology meet the physical character of a particular coast under particular conditions. It happened before the Valencia many times. It happened after her, though less frequently as the technology improved. The Valencia is a moment in a long history of the encounter between maritime ambition and the intractable reality of this specific stretch of ocean. That encounter continues, not in the same form. The ships are different, the instruments are different, the regulatory environment is different, but the encounter between human intention and the sea's indifference to that intention is permanent and structural. People want to go places. The sea is between some of those places. The sea has its character, which does not change to accommodate the wants of people who need to cross it. January on the exposed coast of Vancouver Island is still January. The storms still come in from the southwest. The swells still build to the heights they have always built to. The fog still settles on the water in the way it has always settled, heavy and complete and indifferent to the ships that are moving through it. And somewhere in that fog, on a January night, there is always a ship moving north, with instruments that are as good as they can be made, and with a crew that is as careful as they can be trained to be, and the gap between what the instruments and the training can tell them and what they actually need to know is smaller than it was in 1906, but it is not zero. The sea holds what it holds. The coast waits as it has always waited. And somewhere on the shelf below the water at Pachena Point, the iron of the Valencia is doing what iron does in cold salt water, slowly, steadily, without drama, becoming part of the reef that received it more than 100 years ago, on a January night when the fog was thick, and the current was stronger than the charts showed, and the shore was closer than anyone on the ship believed. There is a particular quality to the light that comes just before dawn on the Pacific coast of Vancouver Island. It does not arrive the way light arrives in cities or in open inland country, not as a sudden lightening of the east, not as a warmth spreading across the sky. It arrives more subtly and more strangely. The fog diffuses it. The overcast filters it. The tall trees of the old-growth forest at the top of the cliffs break it into pieces before it reaches the water. By the time dawnlight arrives at the shoreline of this coast on a January morning, it has been transformed into something grey and ambiguous that is neither dark nor light but both, a quality of the air that is more like an event in the medium through which you see than a source of illumination coming from somewhere else. On the morning of January 5th, 1906, this light arrived over the Valencia while people were still in the rigging and the ship was still on the reef. The accounts describe the light coming as a relief. The darkness had been so absolute for so many hours that even the grey ambiguity of a Pacific coastal dawn was an improvement, a form of clarity, a restoration of the visual world that the dark had taken away. People could see each other. They could see the shore. They could see finally what they had been hearing all night, the rocks, the surf, the water between the ship and the land. Seeing clearly what you are in the middle of is a complicated experience. The survivors who described the dawn described it with a mixture of relief and horror. Relief at the restoration of sight, horror at what sight revealed. The ship was in worse condition than many of them had understood in the dark. The shore was close in a way that was now unambiguous, no longer a matter of estimation or judgment, but of simple visible fact. The rescue ships were visible, standing off in the distance. The situation was now fully visible, and full visibility of such a situation is not the same as comfort. Dawn has a quality in survival situations that is worth noting. In the dark, the imagination fills the space that sight would otherwise occupy. This filling can be accurate or inaccurate, and in survival situations it tends toward the catastrophic. The imagination, freed from the correcting influence of sight, expands the known bad into the potentially worse. Dawn corrects this. It shows what is actually there rather than what the imagination has built. This correction is sometimes better than what the imagination had constructed and sometimes worse, but it is always more useful because you can respond to what is actually there and you cannot effectively respond to what is imagined. The dawn of January 5th on the Valencia showed the people in the rigging what was actually there. The ship was on the reef. The shore was visible. The rescue ships were visible. The conditions were severe, but the situation was not at that moment immediately terminal. There was still time, still structure to hold on to, still the theoretical possibility that conditions might improve and rescue might come. The dawn gave this information, and the people in the rigging received it and responded to it in the way of people who are holding on. They held on. What is the right thing to think about in the hours of early morning, before sleep comes but after the night has passed its middle? This is the hour in which this story finds us, or something like it. The hour in which the night has lost its fullness but the day has not yet arrived, in which the sky outside is not quite dark but the world is not yet bright, in which the body is close to sleep but the mind is still active, processing the story, settling the images of ships and sea and cold water into their proper places in the landscape of memory. The story of the Valencia is a good story for this hour, which is why it has been told now, in this way, at this pace. It is a story that has weight without urgency, that is complete enough to satisfy, but open enough to leave questions that need not be answered tonight. The lifeboat's mystery is appropriate to this hour, not troubling, not demanding resolution, simply interesting, a question that can be held lightly and released as sleep comes. The people in the rigging of the Valencia watching the dawn come were holding on in a different sense than the one available to you now. Their holding on was physical, immediate, a matter of grip and cold and the management of a body that was being tested in very direct ways. Your holding on, if you are still awake at this hour, is of a different kind. The holding on of a person who is almost asleep, and who is choosing, in some not quite conscious way, to stay with the story a little longer before letting go. Let go. The story has told itself. The light has come. The dawn, grey and ambiguous as January dawns on this coast always are, has arrived over the water and over the reef, and over whatever remains of the Valencia in the cold and the dark below the surface. The people in the rigging saw it and held on. You can see it if you choose to hold the image. Grey light, salt air, the sound of surf, the figures against the masts, and then you can let it go. The letting go is the point. It has always been the point. The story was a vehicle for the letting go, a way of giving the mind something to follow that leads gradually away from the considerations of the day and into the simpler, older territory of rest. The Valencia was real, the disaster was real, the ghost lifeboat was real, and all of these real things have served tonight as companions for the journey from the busy world of waking to the quieter world of sleep. The last light before morning on the Pacific coast of Vancouver Island in January 1906 fell on a ship that was breaking apart and on people who were holding on, and on a sea that was doing what the sea does, which is to say it fell without preference, without judgment, without any awareness of the significance of what it was illuminating. It was just light, just the continuation of the day into the dark and the dark giving way to the day, just the ordinary passage of time that has no more ability to stop than the ocean does. Time passes, the light comes, the cold does what cold does, and somewhere in all of this, in the ordinary passage of events that are large or small depending on who is experiencing them, are the people, always the people, the ones in the rigging, and the ones on the shore, and the ones in the rescue ship standing off, and the ones in the offices in Victoria waiting for news, and the ones in the small houses of Bamfield hearing the surf in the night and knowing something was wrong before the first message arrived. People in the light, people in the dark, people holding on and people letting go and people somewhere between the two, which is where most of us are most of the time, not at the extreme of either, but in the ordinary middle distance of a life being lived, a night being passed, a story being told in the dark to someone who is close to sleep. The Pacific is still there. It will be there when you wake. It will be there tomorrow and next year and in the winter a century from now, making its sounds against the same rocks, moving in the same currents that moved the Valencia east toward the shore she did not see. The sea is patient. It has time. It is made of time, in a sense, of the slow geological time in which coasts are formed and eroded and reformed, in which the iron of old ships becomes part of the reef, in which the questions that have no answers are absorbed into the larger question that is the sea itself, which has no answer either and does not need one. Sleep well. The story is done. The light is coming, and you are warm, and you are safe, and the morning when it comes will come the way mornings always come, without announcement, without drama, simply by being there when the dark is done. Before we arrive at the final stillness, there is one more thing worth sitting with. Not a resolution. Resolutions are for day people, for the waking world, for situations where certainty is both possible and useful. This is a question, or rather, it is several questions, and they do not require answers, only the brief attention of a mind that is almost at rest. Let them pass through you, lightly, the way the current passes through the reef at Pachina Point, noticed but not detained. The first question, where was the lifeboat for 27 years? Not in deep water, not exposed to the full ocean. The physical evidence of its condition suggests shelter, suggests a cove or an inlet where the worst of the weather could not reach it. The Broken Group Islands have hundreds of such places. A boat could enter one and, if the angle and the tide were right, never leave it. 27 years in a sheltered cove is not impossible. But it is strange. The strangeness is the thing worth sitting with, not the explanation. The second question, was it empty when it was launched? This is the question that the investigation could not answer, and that the 1933 discovery could not answer either. If it was launched empty, torn from its davits by the surf perhaps, or freed deliberately to drift and mark the location, then the 27 years are the story. If it was launched with people in it, then the 27 years contain another story, which is the story of where those people went, and that story is not recoverable. The third question, and this is the one that has no answer at all, not even a speculative one, is this. What was it like to be in that boat, if anyone was in it, in the dark and the cold and the surf of January 5th, 1906? What was the quality of those hours? What did the people in that boat, if there were people, think about and say and feel in the time between leaving the ship and arriving wherever they arrived? These questions have no answers because there is no one left who knows. The boat came back and said nothing. The sea said nothing. And the people, if there were people, said nothing either. Hold these questions lightly. They do not require resolution. They are the kind of questions that belong to the night, to the space between waking and sleep, to the mind that is looser and more receptive than the daytime mind, and that can hold an unanswered question without needing to close it. The unanswered question is not a problem. It is a feature of the story. It is what keeps the story alive, what makes it still interesting after more than 100 years, what brings people to the West Coast Trail and to the Maritime archives and to this moment, listening in the dark. Maritime history is full of such questions. Ships that disappeared without trace, lifeboats found empty, logbooks that stop mid-entry. The sea is a great generator of unanswered questions, because it is vast and dark and does not keep records in the human sense. What it keeps in the form of matter. The iron on the reef, the cold in the water, the biological record of what lived and died in these waters over the centuries. None of that is an answer to a human question, but it is all there is. The ghost lifeboat is perhaps the best symbol available for the particular quality of mystery that the Valencia leaves behind. Not the ship itself. The ship is too large, too dramatic, too easy to see as the central object. The lifeboat is small. It is specific. It is the right scale for the mystery it contains. A ship is a large public object. A lifeboat is a small private one. A ship carries 164 people. A lifeboat carries at most a few dozen, and in its specificity it raises the possibility of an intimacy, of a small group of people in a small space, in the dark and the cold, in the particular privacy of shared extremity, that the ship's larger story does not quite allow. Whatever happened in that lifeboat, it happened to specific people in a specific small space over a specific period of time. The smallness is the thing, the intimacy is the thing, the gap in the record, where those specific people and that specific space and that specific time should be, is the thing that stays with you after the story is done. The shape of what is missing, which is sometimes more vivid than what is present. The dark asks its questions and does not wait for answers. It moves on, as the dark always moves on, giving way eventually to the light, carrying its unanswered questions with it into the day, where they will be thought about less and felt less urgently, but where they will persist. In the night they are present, in the day they are background, they are always there. Let the questions go now, not resolved. Unresolved questions cannot be let go resolved, but released the way you release breath, the way the hand releases what it no longer needs to hold. The questions are still there. They will be there when you wake. The sea will still have its secrets. The lifeboat will still have its mystery. And none of that will matter right now, because right now the only thing that matters is this, the warmth of where you are, the weight of the dark outside, the slow closing down of the day that is already done, and the beginning of the rest that you need. Thank you so much for watching. If you'd like to see more videos like this, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel. It really helps us continue making more content. Anyways, see you in the next one. And now let the story go. You do not need to hold it. It will keep itself, the way the coast keeps what it keeps, without effort, without intention, simply by being what it is. The ship is on the reef. The lifeboat is in its cove or it is not. The fog is on the water. None of this requires anything of you. You're not the coast. You're not the sea. You're here, warm and still, and the story is complete. Let your breathing slow. It may already be slowing. The body knows what it needs, and what it needs at this hour is rest. The air in the room is warm. The surfaces you are resting on are solid and reliable, and have been holding you this whole time, which they will continue to do without any effort on your part. The dark outside is the ordinary dark of night, which is the same dark that has always come at this hour, which is the dark that has always passed by morning. There is nothing in it that requires your attention. The coast of Vancouver Island is a long way from here, in whatever direction the coast of Vancouver Island lies from where you are. The Pacific is even farther. The fog there is the fog there which has nothing to do with you. Think, if you like, of water. Not the cold water of the January Pacific, not the water that was between the Valencia and the shore that night. Warmer water, still water. The water of a harbour on a calm summer morning, before the wind comes up, when the surface is nearly flat and the reflections of things, boats, pilings, the pale morning sky, are almost perfectly clear in it. That water, still and warm and quiet and capable, in that stillness, of reflecting everything perfectly. Your breath is slow. Your body is heavy in the good way, the weight of rest, the pleasant heaviness of a body that has done what it needed to do today and is ready to be still. The thoughts that arise are not important. They are like the small waves a harbour gets when the morning ferry passes through, momentary, mild, already settling back into flatness by the time they reach the shore. The Valencia is in her place on the reef. The lifeboat is wherever it ended up. The 37 survivors are in their graves now, all of them, having lived their full lives carrying what they carried, and the lives they lived were real and various and complete. The ones who did not survive are in the sea, which has had them for more than 100 years, and has changed them into what the sea changes things into. All of this is as it is. All of it is settled, in the way of things that have had a long time to settle. You are settling now. The breath comes and goes without urgency. The thoughts drift through and do not require engagement. The darkness outside is just darkness, and it is peaceful, and it will be there all night, and in the morning there will be light again, and everything will continue in the way that everything continues. Sleep is near. It may already be here, at the edge of things, the way the tide is near even before you can see it moving. Let it come. You have been listening for a long time, and the listening has been good, and now the listening is done, and there is nothing left but the dark and the warmth and the slow breath and the ordinary silence of a room at rest. The sea is far away, the coast is far away, you are here, you are warm, you are safe. Sleep well. If you liked this story, let me know where in the world you're watching from and what time it is. I'm always curious about that, and if you have a suggested topic, feel free to leave it in the comments.